Hello there, and welcome to our channel, where curiosity gets comfortable, and the natural questions humans have carried for thousands of years finally get a quiet moment to stretch out and breathe. Tonight, we're easing into something a little mysterious, a little unsettling, and strangely comforting once you sit with it for a while. It's the idea that humanity might not be on its very first attempt at building a world. That maybe we've tried this before, maybe more than once, maybe far more times than we realize. And if that thought feels a bit like opening an old drawer and finding something unexpected inside, that's exactly the kind of feeling we're settling into together. When you hear the phrase, "How many times has humanity reset itself?" you might picture dramatic collapses, forgotten civilizations, long-vanished cities swallowed by vines and sand, or entire populations shrinking down to a handful of survivors trying to light a fire in the dark. But the truth is gentler and more complex. It's about patterns we keep stumbling into, skills we rediscover after losing them, worlds that flourish and then break apart, and the strange resilience that has carried us through every rise and fall. It's less like reading a history book and more like listening to the soft echo of footsteps behind you. Belonging to people who lived so long ago, we barely know their names, yet somehow still shape the ground beneath our own. Before we wander too far into these old roads, I'd love to know something simple and grounding. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you right now in your corner of the world? It's a curious contrast, isn't it? You're sitting in a moment shaped by the entire timeline of humanity, a timeline that might be far more broken and stitched back together than we tend to imagine. And yet, you're also just here, in one small slice of evening, or morning, or whatever hour meets you. If you find the quiet of these explorations calming or comforting, I'd be grateful if you gave this a like or subscribed. It helps this small space drift toward others who might need a little softness in the middle of thinking about big ancient questions. Now, even though we're beginning with the idea of humanity resetting itself, we're not rushing toward dramatic imagery. This isn't about apocalyptic storytelling or predictions. It's about understanding something that sits deep in our history, something we often overlook because the present feels so permanent. But if you trace our past far enough, the permanent starts to melt away. What we find instead are layers upon layers of human attempts at building societies, learning to grow food, navigating change, facing disasters, creating knowledge, losing it again, and then trying once more. Sometimes we stumble because the world shifts under our feet. Other times, we stumble because of choices we make ourselves. Either way, the story continues. You might think that with all our technology and all the information we've preserved, we would have a clear picture of every rise and fall behind us. But the truth is that the further we look back, the more the story blurs. Entire cultures disappeared without leaving so much as a stone with their name on it. Others left behind traces so faint that we only realized they existed thousands of years later, because a bit of pottery surfaced in a field or a wall appeared under shifting soil. And some left behind stories carved in myths, told in fragments, hints of memories that sound exaggerated until you start noticing patterns that appear everywhere. The idea of a human reset doesn't necessarily mean everyone vanished. Most of the time, it means societies reaching a point where the world they'd built simply couldn't support itself anymore. Maybe the land dried out or the rain shifted so far that crops wouldn't grow. Maybe conflict wore people down until they scattered. Maybe a disease moved through a region. Maybe the climate changed so slowly, no one noticed until everything fell off balance. These resets were often quiet in the moment, only becoming obvious when looking back across thousands of years. And yet each time humans endured, they reorganized. They started over again, even without knowing they were part of a pattern repeating itself. What makes this idea so compelling is that it reshapes how we imagine ourselves. We're often taught to see human progress as a straight line, a steady climb from stone tools to space travel. But reality has always been messier than that. Instead of a straight line, it resembles a long wandering path, full of forks and loops and sudden dips. Tools were invented, forgotten, and reinvented. Cities rose and fell and rose again somewhere else. Populations expanded, nearly vanished, then slowly rebuilt. If progress were a staircase, we wouldn't be on step 1,000. We'd be on step 100 or so, wondering what happened to all the other staircases that broke, or crumbled, or shifted somewhere out of sight. To understand the idea of resets, we don't start with collapse. We start with the simple fact that humans have been around far longer than our familiar stories suggest. For most of our existence, we lived in small, scattered groups, moving with the seasons, gathering food, making tools from stone and bone, and passing along knowledge through stories and the wisdom of elders. None of these groups built cities, drew up laws, or carved their history into monuments. But they survived. They survived droughts and long winters, volcanic eruptions, shifting coastlines, ice ages, predators, and all the challenges that come with living close to the edge of possibility. And then something changed. Little by little, people learned to gather plants, then to tend them, then to grow them deliberately. They learned to stay in one place long enough for villages to form. Those villages grew into towns. Towns turned into cities. Cities became networks of trade and culture and cooperation. But with growth came fragility. For the first time, people began relying on systems outside their immediate control. If a river shifted, a city might die. If rainfall patterns changed, entire regions might empty. If soil was overworked, fields might stop producing. The larger a society grew, the more interconnected everything became, and the more vulnerable people were to disruptions. Some of these disruptions were natural, some were human-made, some were a combination of both. What ties them together is that they didn't end humanity. They reshaped it. They pushed us into new forms. They forced us to rethink what we relied on. And each time we rebuilt, we did so with a slightly different approach, carrying forward the lessons of the last reset, even if those lessons were passed down through fragments of memory or stories that no one realized were based on real events. As we settle deeper into this journey, it helps to recognize that not all resets are dramatic. Sometimes a reset is simply a quiet decline, followed by a shift in direction. Consider a city that once thrived along a riverbank. If the river dried out over decades, people would slowly leave. Families would move elsewhere. Markets would thin out. Schools would close. The city wouldn't collapse overnight. It would simply fade until all that remained were remnants buried under layers of earth. Later, archaeologists might find pottery, tools, or foundations and realize a whole community once lived there, carrying dreams and routines not so different from ours. The same pattern plays out on larger scales, too. Entire civilizations have followed arcs of growth, stability, stress, and change. Sometimes the stress was too much. Sometimes the world offered challenges faster than people could adapt. Sometimes internal choices made things harder. And yet, after each decline, the story didn't stop. New groups formed, new ideas spread, new attempts took shape. Reset doesn't mean erase. It means the start of another attempt from whatever pieces were left behind. You might wonder why we don't hear more about these older resets. Part of the reason is that the evidence is often subtle. Ancient people didn't always leave behind monumental ruins. Many lived in homes made of wood or earth that returned to the landscape after a generation or two. Their tools decayed. Their stories survived only in oral traditions. Their names vanished, unless carved into something durable. And so much of our deeper past lies quiet under soil or ocean or mountains, waiting for accidental discovery. Another reason is that we prefer tidy narratives. It's easier to imagine humanity moving forward in a straight, steady line than to acknowledge how often we've rebuilt. But when we start looking for resets, they appear everywhere. There were moments when our species nearly died out, moments when major societies crumbled, moments when whole knowledge systems disappeared, moments when populations shrank so drastically that a single spark of change, one group's decision to try something new, shifted the course of history. Yet there is something reassuring about all of this. The resets behind us show that humans are adaptable. They show we have been close to the edge before, yet we found our way forward. They remind us that we are not as fragile as we sometimes fear, nor as invincible as we sometimes imagine. Instead, we are persistent, resourceful, and capable of rebuilding in ways that surprise even ourselves. As you settle in and let your thoughts soften around these ideas, you might notice a sense of curiosity that's not hurried or urgent, just quietly present. The story of humanity's resets isn't a tale of doom. It's a reminder that we've always kept going, that even when the world changed faster than we expected, people adapted. They learned new ways of doing things. They shared ideas across distances. They held on to what mattered and shaped new paths when the old ones became too difficult to walk. And that's where our journey begins, with a recognition that humanity's story stretches back further than our recorded history. That somewhere behind the words written on papyrus or carved into stone lies a longer, quieter story told in migrations, in genetic markers, in changes recorded in layers of earth and ice. A story of restarts happening not once or twice, but many times, each one leaving a faint imprint on the world. As we move forward into this exploration, we'll start following those imprints. Some are carved into landscapes, some lie buried under ash, some are hidden in myth, some are revealed through genetics, and some show up in places we least expect. They don't give us exact answers, but they reveal enough for us to trace the shapes of the worlds that came before ours, the worlds that ended, and the worlds that grew from their remains. When we think about our past, we often picture the familiar highlights. Ancient Egypt, rising along the Nile, Rome stretching across continents, the great temples of India, the early scholars of China, the vast empires of the Americas that shaped whole landscapes with agriculture and astronomy. These are the civilizations we remember because they left behind structures tall enough and writing detailed enough to survive thousands of years. But those are only the surface stories, the parts of human history that sit above ground like the visible tip of a much larger shape. Beneath all of this, hidden in soil, water, and time, are worlds almost entirely forgotten. Entire cultures lived and died long before any of the civilizations we learn about in textbooks ever existed. Most didn't leave monuments. Most didn't carve their thoughts into stone. Most didn't even imagine that someone thousands of years in the future might wonder who they were. And yet, they left behind faint impressions of themselves that linger quietly in unexpected places, waiting to be recognized. These older worlds aren't forgotten because they were unimportant. They're forgotten because time erases gently but thoroughly. Wooden houses, woven clothing, baskets, tools made from bone, seeds kept in clay pots, boats made from reeds, even entire villages built from materials pulled directly from the landscape. All of it disappears faster than stone or metal. Rain, wind, plant roots, rising seas, shifting soils, and the simple passage of centuries turn the traces of daily life into sediment. Only the most persistent fragments survive. A chipped stone tool, a piece of broken pottery, charcoal from a long extinguished fire. These remnants don't announce themselves. They wait until someone happens to dig in the right place, or until the earth moves and exposes a moment that should have stayed buried a little longer. If we could watch a single year unfold 50,000 years ago, we'd see communities that felt as real and lively as our own. People waking up to the sounds of their families. People building shelters, weaving nets, cooking meals, telling stories, caring for children, collecting resources, and navigating weather, shifting from warm to cold. We'd see art appear on cave walls, handprints pressed onto stone, pigments made from crushed minerals, and shapes drawn from memory, all giving us glimpses of what mattered to them, even though the details have fallen silent. The forgotten worlds beneath our feet aren't limited to early humans, roaming in small groups. Some belong to settled communities that created their own traditions, organized their own structures, and found their own ways to survive in landscapes that were no longer recognizable. Many lived through enormous climate shifts. Around 15,000 years ago, ice sheets began melting rapidly, reshaping coastlines, draining lakes, and flooding enormous areas where people once lived. Entire groups would have watched their settlements slowly disappear under rising water. Whatever they built, whatever routes they followed, whatever stories they shared, ended up submerged. Today, those lands sit under oceans, sometimes buried beneath thick layers of silt, unreachable without advanced tools, and often impossible to identify with certainty. What makes these older worlds so intriguing is that they hint at far more complexity than we once believed. For a long time, the assumption was that early humans lived simple, isolated lives with limited cooperation. But the quiet evidence that surfaces contradicts that picture. When we find identical tool designs spread across continents, it suggests sharing of ideas. When we find shells transported hundreds of kilometers inland, it suggests long-distance contact or trade. When we find ceremonial structures older than agriculture, it suggests that people gathered for reasons beyond survival. These discoveries make it clear that early humans weren't waiting around for civilization to begin. They were already forming the foundations long before recorded history. Some of the most intriguing forgotten worlds lie buried in places no one expected. For example, ancient shoreline sites, now deep underwater, contain remnants of hearths, flint tools, and fishing equipment. These were once coastal communities, thriving near the water's edge until sea levels rose by over 100 meters after the last ice age. Imagine entire villages, maybe even networks of them, slowly becoming uninhabitable as the ocean crept upward. People would have moved inland, carrying only what they could. The structures they left behind became the seafloor. Today, they form a vast underwater archive stretching across continental shelves. A record of lives erased not by disaster, but by gradual environmental change. On land, forgotten worlds hide beneath layers of newer settlements. Many ancient cities were built over older ones. When one community declined or relocated, another group would settle in the same place because the location offered water, fertile soil, or strategic advantages. Over centuries, this layering created deep cultural stacks. In some places, archaeologists dig down through thousands of years of continuous habitation, each layer representing a different attempt at living in the same place. Most of those older layers belong to societies that existed for centuries, yet left no written record, no recognizable name. They remain known only for the shapes of their homes or the style of their pottery. What we call a forgotten world doesn't have to be ancient. Some societies disappeared only a millennium or two ago. Yet they left such limited traces that we barely know anything about them. In forested regions, whole settlements can vanish when vegetation takes over. In deserts, shifting sands cover everything. In volcanic regions, eruptions bury landscapes in minutes. The Earth is constantly reshaping the surface, and with it, the evidence of the people who lived before us. Understanding these forgotten worlds means accepting that humanity has always been more widespread and diverse than our written record suggests. It means acknowledging that countless groups developed their own forms of knowledge that never made it into surviving texts. They had their own techniques for building shelters, preserving food, navigating terrain, and understanding nature. Many of these practices were passed down through generations until disruptions scattered people or forced them to move, breaking the chain of tradition. What remained behind was eventually reclaimed by the land. Sometimes, though, the land preserves things unexpectedly well. In peat bogs, oxygen-poor conditions slowed decay, allowing organic material to survive for thousands of years. In cold environments, ice preserves bones, tools, and even human remains in remarkable detail. In dry caves, delicate artifacts remain protected from moisture. These preserved fragments let us piece together small parts of lives lived long before the earlier civilizations we recognize. But even these glimpses are tiny compared to the full worlds they came from. There's also the overlooked reality that many cultures didn't think of permanence the way later societies did. They didn't build structures meant to last centuries. Their knowledge lived in memory, in shared practice, in ceremonies, and in the wisdom of elders. When a community moved or changed, they might leave almost nothing behind that modern tools can detect. The absence of ruins doesn't mean the absence of civilization. It means the civilization measured itself differently. When we consider forgotten worlds, it helps to imagine human history not as a single line of progression, but as a wide landscape with many paths. Some of those paths led to large, complex societies that built cities and learned to record information. Others led to smaller groups that maintained steady ways of life for thousands of years without expanding. Both forms were part of the larger human story. Both contributed knowledge that shaped future generations in ways that leave subtle hints in genetics, languages, cultural practices, and tools. There's something grounding about recognizing that much of our past lies hidden. It means we're walking on layers of stories, some of which shaped the conditions for our own world. The crops we grow today were domesticated by groups we know almost nothing about. The early techniques of tracking seasons and understanding weather came from people whose names were never written down. The first navigators, the first long-distance traders, the first groups who discovered how to cultivate plants or domesticate animals, all belonged to societies whose names washed away over time. Yet their contributions live on quietly in the routines of daily life. Some forgotten worlds may have been more advanced than we assume. Advancement doesn't necessarily mean towering structures or metal tools. It can mean sophisticated knowledge of plants, astronomy, seasonal cycles, engineering techniques using natural materials, or social systems that allowed large groups to coordinate. There are archaeological sites older than agriculture, with structures that required planning, organization, and shared effort. These places challenge the assumption that complex society must develop in a certain order. They show that humans were experimenting with social structures long before we thought they were capable of such efforts. As we look across the planet today, we see landscapes shaped by hands we can no longer name. Terraces carved into mountainsides, fields that follow geometric patterns, reservoirs built with layers of stone. Even forests bear the marks of old agricultural systems that have been overgrown. These reminders aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're only revealed through satellite images, or when farmers notice soil behaving differently than expected. They are the quiet footprints of forgotten worlds that once thrived. Recognizing these buried histories changes how we view our own place in time. It reminds us that civilization isn't a one-time achievement. It's something that many human groups have built in their own ways. Some lasted for millennia. Others flourished only briefly, but each left something behind in the broader human story, even if the details are sparse. Their world shaped the environment, influenced migrations, spread ideas, and created foundations for later societies without ever being acknowledged in written history. The forgotten worlds beneath our feet also show us that resets don't always involve catastrophe. Sometimes they happen slowly through environmental change, shifting resources, or gradual movement. A culture might decline quietly as its people join neighboring groups or adapt to new circumstances. Their traditions blend into others. Their unique ways of living dissolve into broader patterns. Over time, their distinct identity fades until it's no longer distinguishable. The world they built becomes one more layer in the landscape. When researchers uncover these older worlds, they often describe a sense of closeness to the people who lived there. It's not the grandiosity of monumental ruins that creates this feeling, but the small details. A child's footprint preserved in clay, marks from cutting tools on animal bones, charred seeds from a cooking fire, the worn edge of a tool held thousands of times by hands long gone. These details make it clear that the people who lived in these forgotten worlds had routines, challenges, joys, and worries not so different from our own. The more we learn about these hidden societies, the more we realize how much is missing. Vast regions of the planet have never been thoroughly studied. Thick forests, deep oceans, remote deserts, and frozen landscapes hold countless secrets. Every year, new sites are discovered that push the timeline of human activity further back. What we know now is only a fraction of what existed. And it's likely that many worlds will never be found at all, their traces erased completely by time. Yet, the uncertainty itself is meaningful. It tells us that humanity's story is larger than the version we commonly tell. It stretches deeper than our earliest chronicles. It includes peoples whose influence still threads through the present, even though they themselves have disappeared from view. And that sense of depth of countless layers beneath our feet adds context to the resets we'll explore further, because each reset didn't happen in isolation. It happened within a larger, older, more varied human story that continues to unfold. The worlds beneath the surface become the foundation for understanding how many times humanity has reshaped itself. They remind us that the answers aren't found only in monuments or written accounts, but in the quiet, persistent traces left behind by millions of people who lived through changes we can only imagine. They faced shifts in climate, in landscape, in resources, and in the balance between stability and struggle. They adapted, sometimes successfully, and sometimes not. Their worlds may be forgotten, but the patterns they experienced continue through every era that follows, including our own. Fire is such an ordinary part of our world today that it's easy to forget how deeply it changed everything about human life. We light candles, switch on stoves, cook dinner without thinking about it, and sit by campfires as if the flames belong to us by natural right. But fire was not always ours. There was a time when humans were just another species, moving through landscapes filled with dangers they couldn't control, storms they couldn't predict, and nights that were far darker and colder than anything we experience now. And then somewhere, long before the first villages, long before the first myths, and long before the earliest forgotten worlds beneath our feet, fire entered our history in a way so transformative that it shifted the entire direction of what it meant to be human. When people talk about breakthroughs, they often point to the invention of agriculture, the rise of cities, or the beginning of writing. But none of those would have unfolded the way they did without the reset that happened when humans learned how to use and eventually create fire. Before that moment, our ancestors lived with a narrower set of possibilities. Their days were shaped entirely by daylight, their diets limited to what could be eaten raw or scavenged, and their nights governed by the presence of predators who had better vision, sharper claws, and more experience navigating darkness. The cold could be lethal, food could be scarce, and survival meant constantly moving and adapting to whatever the environment allowed. But something shifted when early humans not only encountered fire, but began to understand it. At first, fire was a force that appeared after lightning storms or volcanic eruptions. Many animals approached those burning landscapes cautiously, seeing flames as a threat. Humans likely felt the same fear initially, keeping their distance, watching from the edges. But curiosity is one of our defining traits. That curiosity drew our ancestors closer. They discovered warmth that could cut through cold nights. They discovered that cooked meat softened, tasted different, and could be chewed more easily. They learned that fire frightened predators, created safe zones, and allowed groups to stay in one place longer, without worry of what might emerge from the dark. The use of fire didn't happen overnight. It took generations of observation, imitation, trial, and memory. Early humans may have carried burning branches from natural fires, tended embers in sheltered spaces, and gradually developed techniques for keeping flames alive long after the original source had vanished. The moment fire became something humans could maintain rather than something they stumbled upon was the beginning of one of humanity's earliest resets. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve collapse. It was a quiet but irreversible shift that changed behavior, biology, and culture all at once. Cooking alone reshaped our species in profound ways. Raw food requires significant effort to digest. Chewing dense roots, tough meats, and fibrous plants takes time and energy. Cooking softens food, releases more calories, and expands what can be safely eaten over long spans of time. This change influenced the size of our teeth, the structure of our jaws, and even the way our digestive systems function. With more energy extracted from the same amount of food, our brains could grow larger and more complex. This isn't just speculation. It's something scientists have studied through comparisons between raw and cooked diets, as well as through the fossil record. Before fire, our ancestors needed hours and hours each day just to chew enough food to survive. After fire, everything became more efficient. Fire also altered how humans interacted socially. Once nighttime became a time for gathering rather than hiding, shared spaces emerged. Groups could sit together, warming themselves, sharing food, telling stories, and forming bonds that extended beyond immediate survival. These gatherings created stronger social structures, more consistent communication, and better coordination. Firelight extended the day, giving humans extra hours to think, plan, and reflect. Those evenings were likely the earlier stages of storytelling, teaching, and passing down knowledge. Without fire, many aspects of culture that we now take for granted would never have had the space to develop. What makes this moment a reset, rather than just a technological advance, is that it reshaped how humans related to their environment. Before fire, survival meant adapting to nature. With fire, humans began to shape nature deliberately. They cleared land using controlled burns. They created safe zones around their dwellings. They encouraged certain plants to grow by reducing competition through fire cycles. In a sense, fire was humanity's first tool for environmental engineering. It wasn't agriculture yet, but it was a step toward managing landscapes rather than simply living within them. There's evidence from multiple regions suggesting that early humans used fire to influence where animals grazed, how certain plants spread, and which areas remained accessible for foraging. These practices didn't require long-term plans or formal knowledge systems. They arose from observation and repetition. When people noticed that fresh growth sprouted after fires, attracting animals, they began using fire intentionally. When they saw that fire cleared paths, reduced pests, or created more open spaces, they repeated the process. Over generations, these behaviors became part of the pattern of human life. This wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of shaping ecosystems. As humans grew more comfortable with fire, something else happened. Night became safer. Predators that once dominated the dark avoided flames. Humans could sleep with more security and spend less energy staying alert. This increased safety, changed how groups organized themselves. It allowed infants and children to survive in greater numbers. It gave adults more time to teach skills. It created opportunities for division of labor, with some tending fires, while others gathered resources. When you trace these changes forward, you see how fire influenced population growth, skill development, and the expansion of social networks. The memory of these early changes persists even now in the way fire appears in myths across cultures. Many stories describe fire as a gift, a discovery, or something taken from the natural world through effort or chance. These stories are remnants of a time when learning to use fire marked a fundamental shift in how humans experience the world. They capture the idea that fire wasn't just a tool, but a turning point, one that separated earlier forms of life from new possibilities. Before fire, humans were limited to what their bodies could do. After fire, survival became a combination of biological ability and environmental control. This change made it possible to inhabit colder regions, travel farther, and adapt to climates that would have been impossible to endure otherwise. As groups moved into new landscapes, their experiences diversified. They encountered different plants, animals, and challenges. Fire remained a constant companion, providing continuity even as humans explored unfamiliar territories. It's important to understand that this reset was not a single moment. It was a gradual process that unfolded across many regions. Some groups adopted fire earlier than others. Some used it for simple warmth. Others began cooking. Others learned controlled burning. But collectively, these changes formed a shift so significant that human evolution and culture branched in new directions. You can see the impact of fire in the fossils of early humans, whose body structures change over time. You can trace it in archaeological sites, where ash layers mark repeated burning. You can sense it in the knowledge systems passed down through countless generations. As humans integrated fire deeper into their lives, they began creating new kinds of spaces. Shelters became more stable when fire provided warmth. Camps could remain in one place longer when predators were kept at bay. Tools could be hardened through heat. Materials such as clay could be transformed. All of these developments contributed to the foundation of later advances. But at the time, they were simply adaptations to immediate needs. What makes fire such a meaningful reset is that it changed not only what humans could do, but how they thought about possibilities. When you can warm yourself, cook food, gather safely at night, and keep animals away, you begin to imagine new ways of living. You experiment more freely, you test limits, you take chances that wouldn't have been possible before. Fire created room for imagination. It gave humans the opportunity to explore not just the environment, but their own potential. Even today, fire shapes how we understand comfort, safety, and home. A warm meal, a lit room, a stable temperature, a sense of protection at night. All of these experiences come from the shift that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. We rarely think about it, but fire is still woven into the structure of daily life. Without it, our world would be unfamiliar in ways that are difficult to imagine. This reset didn't erase anything. It didn't replace older behaviors entirely, but it added a layer to human life that made everything afterward possible. When we consider how many times humanity has reshaped itself, fire stands at the beginning of that sequence. It marks the moment when humans first took an element of nature and made it part of their identity. It shows that our ability to adapt isn't just reactive, it's creative. And that creativity has carried us through every other reset that followed. As we look further into humanity's past, this early shift prepares us for understanding later transformations. The same traits that allowed humans to tame fire, curiosity, observation, experimentation, and persistence, reappear in every major turning point. Fire was the first sign that humans could change not only themselves, but the world around them, and that capability shaped every step that came next. The story of humanity is often told as though it followed a steady climb, moving from simple beginnings to more complex societies in a straight line. But when we look deeper into our past, there's a moment where that line nearly vanished. A moment when the world shifted so dramatically that only a small number of humans survived. A moment when the familiar rhythm of seasons slipped into something unfamiliar and punishing. A moment when the very existence of our species hung on the edge of cold, hunger, and isolation. It was a long winter that lasted far beyond anything any modern culture has experienced. And it reshaped humanity in ways still visible today. This wasn't a single cold season, or even a difficult decade. It was part of a broader climatic event thousands of years ago when sudden cooling pushed ecosystems into decline. Evidence of this shift appears in ice cores, volcanic ash layers, and remnants of ancient plant life that stopped growing almost simultaneously across large regions. During this period, temperatures dropped quickly enough to challenge every species that depended on stable weather. For humans, who were still learning how to survive in a world that changed without warning, this was one of the greatest tests our ancestors ever faced. Before this cold period took hold, early humans were already spreading across different landscapes. They were adapting to forests, grasslands, and coastlines. They had fire, tools, and social structures, but they still relied heavily on what the environment provided. When temperatures dropped, plants struggled to grow, animals migrated or declined, and predictable patterns disappeared. In some areas, people could no longer remain in the places they had lived for generations. They had to move, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, depending on what resources were available. Entire groups shifted their routes, searching for food, shelter, and warmth. This was not a migration of choice. It was a movement driven by necessity. And as the cold deepened, it pushed populations into smaller and smaller regions where conditions were slightly less severe. These pockets of survivable habitat became refugees, but they were limited in size and resources. Not everyone made it. Genetic studies suggest that at one point, humanity may have been reduced to a very small number of individuals. Some estimates propose thousands, others suggest even fewer. Whatever the exact number, it was small enough that the genetic diversity of our species almost disappeared. Imagine what life was like for the groups who survived. Cold winds sweeping across open land, constant hunger pressing on daily decisions, long days of searching for food with limited success, nights by the fire where warmth was fleeting and the air outside stung with frost, social groups shrinking as members struggled with illness, injury, or exposure. The loss of elders meant the loss of knowledge. The loss of children meant the loss of a future. Every day carried uncertainty, and the margin for error was nearly non-existent. Yet even in these conditions, humans found ways to keep going. They created more efficient clothing, learned to track animals better, improved their shelters, and refined their use of fire. They discovered new ways to store food and new strategies for dividing responsibilities within small groups. These weren't leaps forward in technology. They were gradual adjustments born from daily survival. But together, they formed a pattern that helped our ancestors endure the cold long enough for the world to shift again. One of the striking things about this period is how it changed human movement. Instead of spreading out, groups became concentrated. Instead of exploring widely, they stayed close to reliable sources of water or areas where animals still passed through. Over time, these concentrated groups developed stronger social bonds because they depended on each other for survival more than ever before. Cooperation wasn't optional, it was essential. Sharing became a necessity, not a gesture. People learned new roles, adapted to new expectations, and found ways to maintain group stability despite constant stress. During this long winter, the concept of home changed. It became less about a particular place and more about the presence of a dependable group. The small cluster of individuals could create a sense of stability even when the landscape around them felt hostile. The importance of social cohesion deepened. Groups that worked well together survived. Groups with too much internal conflict struggled. This period refined the social instincts that continue to shape humans' behavior today. The long winter also affected how humans thought about timing and planning. When the environment is harsh and unpredictable, short-term decisions aren't enough. Our ancestors learned to anticipate seasonal shifts more carefully, even if those seasons were colder and longer than before. They became more strategic in how they hunted, how they stored food, how they built shelters, and how they traveled. These behaviors gradually strengthened neural pathways related to problem solving, memory, and cooperation. The pressure of survival didn't just change their actions, it shaped their minds. The world during this cold period wasn't uniformly frozen. Some regions remained habitable, though still difficult. Forests that had once been vibrant became sparse. Grasslands turned into cold steppe environments. Lakes and rivers froze for longer periods. Animal species that had depended on warm climates either died off or migrated far away. In some places, the landscape resembled the modern Arctic tundra. In others, it was a patchy mix of ice, snow, and hardy vegetation that survived through extreme conditions. Despite these challenges, archaeological evidence reveals that humans continue to create tools, build structures, and maintain cultural practices. Small carvings, simple artworks, and symbolic items suggest that even in the harshest of times, people found ways to express themselves. These artifacts aren't elaborate. They're humble, made from bone, stone, or charcoal. But they reveal that humans held on to meaning even when survival required almost all of their energy. Rituals, stories, and shared symbols likely provided comfort, unity, and a way to make sense of the difficult conditions. During this period, humanity didn't spread new technologies rapidly. Instead, improvements happened slowly and locally. A more efficient spear point here, a better storage pit there, a modified clothing style that retained more warmth. These innovations didn't travel far because groups were so isolated from one another. But isolation also created diversity. Different regions developed different solutions based on what materials were available and what challenges they faced. When the climate later warmed, these diverse adaptations contributed to a wider range of human knowledge. It's important to recognize that this long winter didn't erase humanity, it narrowed it. It squeezed our species into tight corners of the world, reducing our numbers, but sharpening our resilience. The people who survived became the ancestors of all modern humans. Their strategies, behaviors, and ways of thinking spread forward through time, influencing how later societies formed and how future generations responded to challenges. Even after the cold began to ease, the world didn't immediately return to what it had been. Landscapes changed slowly. Forest regrew gradually. Animals returned in shifting patterns. Human groups began to spread out again, but their movements were cautious. They carried the memory of scarcity, even if they didn't articulate it consciously. The experience of survival left a mark that lasted for thousands of years. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how it shaped human relationships with the environment. Before the long winter, humans had a broader range of habitats and more flexibility in where they could live. Afterward, they had a deeper awareness of which landscapes offered reliable resources. They understood the value of certain types of terrain, water sources, and animal migration paths. These insights informed later decisions about settlement, migration, and land use. Another change that emerged from this long winter was the refinement of communication. When small groups depend on each other for survival, misunderstandings can be costly. Clearer communication, more consistent teaching, and stronger shared understanding became essential. Over generations, this likely contributed to the development of more complex language structures. Not because people suddenly invented new forms of speech, but because the pressure to survive pushed them toward more efficient ways of expressing information. The long winter also influenced the development of technology related to warmth. Clothing became more sophisticated, woven or stitched to retain heat. Early forms of insulation appeared in shelters. Fire use became more refined, not just for cooking or protection, but for controlling indoor temperatures and preserving food. Some groups learned to use caves or natural shelters more effectively, taking advantage of stable temperatures underground. Though this period was difficult, it wasn't a time of constant suffering. There were days of rest, moments of laughter, and times when food was abundant enough for people to relax. Even in harsh climates, communities found rhythms that worked for them. They observed patterns in weather, learned the best times to travel, and developed routines that balanced effort and conservation of energy. Life was challenging, but it wasn't without structural meaning. The people who lived through this cold period carried the imprint of it in their descendants. Genetic studies show signs of population bottlenecks, consistent with the severe reduction in human numbers. These genetic signatures are found in modern populations across the world, indicating that all humans today descend from those who survived the long winter. It's a quiet reminder that our entire species came close to disappearing, yet managed to hold on through determination, adaptability, and the strength of small communities working together. As the world gradually warmed again, humans began to move outward, exploring new territories and expanding into regions that had been uninhabitable during the cold. These movements weren't sudden waves. They unfolded over generations with families and small groups following animals, rivers, or seasonal changes. The knowledge gained during the long winter guided these decisions. People were more cautious, but also more capable. They understood how to adjust to changing conditions and how to spot subtle signs of environmental stability. This renewed spread didn't just repopulate the world, it set the stage for future advancements. As groups encountered new environments, they developed new techniques, tools, and cultural practices. The resilience honed during the long winter allowed them to adapt more effectively. The experience of surviving near extinction likely shaped the psychology of early humans, reinforcing the importance of social cooperation, resource management, and storytelling as tools for maintaining shared identity. This cold period also left behind a legacy in the myths and oral traditions of later cultures. Many groups around the world have stories about great darkness, long winters, or times when the world grew cold and people struggled to survive. These stories vary widely in detail, but their themes are consistent enough to suggest deep ancestral memories of a difficult era. They aren't scientific accounts, but they capture the emotional truth of what long ago ancestors endured. As the climate continued to shift and eventually stabilized into warmer conditions, humanity's numbers grew again. Populations expanded, new technologies emerged, and forgotten worlds began to form on landscapes once shaped by ice. But underneath those later developments lies the memory of a time when survival depended on small decisions made daily under harsh conditions. Even when communities grew larger and more stable, the lessons of that long winter influenced how people approached challenges, how they valued cooperation, and how they organized their lives. The long winter that nearly erased us is not just an event in the distant past. It's part of the foundation of human identity. It explains why humans are so adaptable, why they form strong social bonds, and why they can endure long periods of difficulty. It also shows that our species has faced near extinction before and found ways to survive. Through a combination of ingenuity, resilience, and collective effort. When we picture ancient civilizations, we usually imagine the ones that left behind monuments tall enough to impress anyone who looks at them today. We think of pyramids rising out of desert sand, stone temples carved with intricate symbols, or cities arranged in geometrical patterns that echo across centuries. But those visible civilizations are only a small part of our story. Many others existed long before, built worlds that shaped the course of human history, and then disappeared so completely that all that remains are faint traces buried beneath soil, water, and time. These lost worlds didn't fade because they were less important. They slipped from memory because the earth is always moving, always reclaiming, always reshaping the things people leave behind. When we think back to the cold centuries where humanity barely survived, it's easy to imagine life becoming simpler afterward, with people slowly recovering before eventually building the civilizations we recognize. But the truth is more complicated. There were societies thousands of years older than the earlier stories we have written down. They were organized, skilled, and capable in ways that continued to surprise archaeologists. Some had agriculture long before mainstream timelines acknowledge. Some built settlements that suggest planning and cooperation. Some traded materials across long distances before anyone imagined humans were capable of such travel. And some developed cultural systems that influenced later societies, even though the original cultures themselves eventually disappeared. One of the reasons these civilizations are forgotten is because they didn't always use durable materials. Stone lasts, but wood doesn't. Clay crumbles, unless the conditions are perfect. Metal corrodes. Textiles vanish rapidly, unless preserved in exceptional environments. And so, when we imagine the past, we tend to picture stone because it's the last to erode. But most early human settlements were not made of stone. They were made of whatever was available. Wood, reeds, packed earth, woven materials, or mud structures that dissolve back into the environment within generations. Imagine a thriving village built with skill and care, full of families who farmed nearby fields, crafted tools, shared meals, raised children, and held celebrations. If that village were abandoned due to shifting climate, changes in rivers, disease, or conflict, the structures would slowly weaken. Within a century, the roofs would collapse. Within a few more years, plants would overtake the remains. After enough time, even the outlines of homes would be difficult to recognize. After thousands of years, all that might remain are fragments of tools, pottery, or seeds buried beneath layers of soil. And if a later group settled on top of the same location, constructing their own homes, the older layers would be sealed away, waiting for someone thousands of years later to notice that the ground beneath their feet hides entire lifetimes. This process happened repeatedly around the world. In some regions, ancient settlements lie dozens of layers beneath modern cities. In others, rivers shifted and buried worlds in sediment. In coastal areas, rising seas swallowed entire landscapes. Forests grew over old pathways. Deserts expanded and covered homes with sand. The earth doesn't preserve everything equally. The parts that remain visible today come from cultures that either used durable materials or lived in environments that slowed decay. And this is why so many civilizations are considered lost. They existed fully in their own time, shaped daily life through routines and traditions, influenced the people around them, and contributed to the broader human story. But because they didn't leave monuments, or because the monuments didn't survive, their identities faded. We know they were there because we find pieces of pottery where no pottery should be. We find agriculture appearing suddenly in regions far apart, suggesting the idea spread from somewhere older. We find tools made from materials that traveled long distances. We find art that hints at belief systems, social roles, and ways of understanding the world. Consider early farming societies in regions where the climate later shifted dramatically. Some areas that were once fertile are now deserts. People lived there for thousands of years, built communities, and developed knowledge about plants, water management, and seasonal patterns. When the climate changed, those communities moved or collapsed. Their fields dried, their irrigation systems filled with sand, their homes crumbled. Today, these places look barren, but beneath the surface lie remnants of the people who once thrived there. In forests, lost worlds hide under layers of vegetation that grew after human presence faded. Soil records hint at agriculture through chemical signatures. Tree patterns reveal old clearings. Faint mounds or depressions suggest long-gone homes. Occasionally, stone foundations remain, but they're often so subtle that only careful mapping can detect them. These forest civilizations were not isolated sites. Some had roads, networks of settlements, and sophisticated land management. They lived sustainably for centuries before disappearing due to drought, disease, or encroaching changes they couldn't predict. Along coastlines, many ancient settlements now sit underwater. The end of the Ice Age caused sea levels to rise dramatically, flooding areas where humans lived long before the oceans reached their current boundaries. Beneath shallow offshore waters, researchers have found remains of tools, hearths, and structures. These aren't isolated sites. They're parts of landscapes that once held thousands of people. Whole cultures lived along coastlines now submerged. Their histories lost not because they failed, but because the world around them changed. The ocean floor holds a massive chapter of human history we've barely begun to uncover. There are also societies that built structures using earthworks rather than stone. These designs can be enormous, covering vast areas with shapes visible only from above. Over time, many of these works flattened, eroded, or were covered by vegetation. Some still exist, but weren't recognized as human-made until recently. These earthwork cultures organized labor, planned large-scale projects, and created symbolic shapes or meeting spaces that showed deliberate design. They weren't primitive. They were simply building with materials that didn't endure as visibly as stone. Another reason civilizations become lost is that their decline wasn't sudden. Slow decline leaves fewer dramatic traces. A city abandoned gradually becomes a quiet place. People drift away, buildings weaken, walls fall. Without a dramatic destruction event, no fire, no invasion, no ruin. Archaeologists have fewer clues. Time smooths everything. A once thriving center becomes a gentle rise in a field, a place where grass grows a little differently but reveals nothing at first glance. There are also societies erased not by time, but by the arrival of other groups who built on top of their remains. When a new culture settles in an area, they repurpose materials, redirect water, create new structures, and reorganize space. Over generations, memories fade. The earlier inhabitants become stories, then fragments of stories, then nothing at all. Eventually, the only hint that another civilization once lived there comes from objects uncovered deep beneath the foundations of newer settlements. What makes all of this significant is not simply that civilizations were lost, but that these forgotten societies contributed quietly to the development of humanity. Their innovations didn't vanish completely. They spread techniques for farming, for crafting tools, for building shelters, for navigating landscapes, for understanding seasons. All of these practices emerged long before written history and traveled across generations. Even when the societies that developed them faded away, their knowledge endured. And then there are the mysterious sites that contradict our assumptions about human capabilities at certain times. Places showing architectural planning older than expected. Places where groups gathered in large numbers before agriculture officially began. Places suggesting that humans experimented with community building and ritual spaces long before cities were documented. These sites aren't anomalies. They're evidence that our timeline is more complex than we once believed. They show that humans were not waiting for civilization to begin. They were always experimenting, adapting, and building in ways that made sense for their time. Sometimes the silence left behind by these civilizations is part of what makes them fascinating. When a culture leaves no writing, no identifiable symbols, and no direct record of its beliefs, we're left with only material clues. The shapes of tools, the arrangements of stones, the distribution of pottery fragments, the wear patterns on bones. These details create outlines, but not full pictures. They invite questions rather than providing answers. And in that silence, the scope of human possibility expands. We realize that countless lives were lived with depth, meaning complexity, even if the evidence doesn't survive well enough for us to see the full picture. Even the most advanced modern technologies struggle to recover these histories fully. Ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and deep ocean mapping reveal some hidden structures, but they can't reconstruct entire cultures. They show that there is more beneath the surface than we expected. They reveal patterns that suggest large populations, organized settlements, and long-term habitation. They show roads carved into landscapes where no obvious civilization is known. They show geometric patterns under forests. They show old riverbeds lined with remnants of human life. But they don't explain the stories behind these fragments. These lost civilizations remind us that not every society leaves behind monuments designed to last thousands of years. Some cultures focused on living in balance with their environment. Some valued mobility. Some valued sustainability over permanence. Some lived in regions where longevity of physical structures was impossible due to environmental conditions. Their achievements weren't measured in stone, but in knowledge, cooperation, and adaptability. As researchers study these lost worlds, they often encounter evidence of resilience. People surviving floods, droughts, volcanic eruptions, and dramatic climate shifts. People adapting to new conditions. People moving when necessary, rebuilding when needed, and integrating with neighboring groups. These quiet responses to change didn't lead to recorded histories, but they shaped the course of human development. Even when a civilization disappears completely, its influence can persist through genetic exchange, shared technologies, or shifts in trade routes. A forgotten culture might have introduced a new crop variety or a tool-making technique that spread widely before the society itself dissolved. That influence becomes part of the broader human story, even if the name of the culture no longer exists. The silence left behind by these civilizations also shows us how fragile memory can be. Without written language or durable monuments, stories can vanish within a few generations. Oral traditions change over time. Details blur. Events become symbolic. Sometimes the descendants of lost civilizations continue living nearby without realizing they walk atop the remains of their own ancestors. Their knowledge shifts, adapting to new circumstances, while the physical record of their past fades beneath them. This pattern isn't unique to any region. It has happened in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in Oceania. Every continent holds traces of societies that lived full lives before fading away. Their contributions survive quietly in the present, even if their names and identities do not. These lost civilizations form an essential part of the background. They show that rise and decline are natural cycles, not failures. They reveal that societies can flourish for centuries and then disappear without grand destruction or collapse. They remind us that human history is far deeper and more layered than what survives above ground. When we think about the world as it is now, with coastlines mapped, cities lined up along the water, ports connecting trade routes, and beaches stretching out under predictable tides, it's easy to forget that sea levels haven't always looked like this. The boundaries between land and ocean have shifted countless times, sometimes slowly, and sometimes with enough force to reshape entire continents. Long before recorded history, the seas rose in ways that changed human life in profound ways. And those changes created one of the most significant resets humanity has ever experienced. Not through a single event, but through a long, steady transformation that erased landscapes, swallowed entire regions, and forced countless societies to move, rebuild, and adapt. To understand what happened, we have to remember the cold period that tightened its grip on the world for centuries. During the Ice Ages, massive glaciers held enormous amounts of water locked in ice. Sea levels were far lower than they are today. What is now the ocean floor, in many places, used to be dry land. Wide plains connected regions that are now isolated islands. Coastlines stretched far beyond their modern boundaries, creating environments with rivers, lakes, forests, and grasslands where communities lived for thousands of years. These were not empty spaces. They were home to people who hunted, gathered, farmed, built communities, and maintained traditions. They raised families there, crafted tools, shaped the land, and built entire ways of life that made sense for their climate. But as temperatures warmed after the long winter, the ice began to melt. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow process, measured in centuries, but slow doesn't mean gentle. A glacier doesn't need to disappear overnight to cause disruption. Even small changes in temperature can lead to significant ice loss. Over generations, coastlines shifted inland, rivers changed course, floodplains expanded, areas that had once been fertile turned marshy, and places where humans had lived for dozens of generations gradually slipped beneath rising seas. It's hard to grasp the scale of this transformation when looking at modern maps. But if we were to peel back the oceans, we would find entire landscapes now hidden beneath waves. Valleys where families once walked, hills where people built shelters, plains where animals grazed, paths that connected communities. These regions weren't empty wilderness. They were human homes shaped by countless footsteps, decisions, and stories. As the seas rose, some groups had enough time to move gradually. They shifted inland, adapting as they went, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them. But for others, the change was rapid enough to create crisis. Floodwaters don't need to rush in like a modern disaster movie to be destructive. A slow encroachment is enough to disrupt farming, reduce food availability, or force groups into competition for shrinking land. When rising seas cut off areas that once connected communities, trade routes disappeared. Social networks that had existed for generations became harder to maintain. Eventually, many coastal societies fragmented, relocated, or blended with inland groups, leaving behind traces too subtle to survive millennia. All that remains now are hints: a piece of flint found underwater, a fishing weight from a settlement long drowned, a layer of sediment that shows human activity, before abruptly shifting to marine conditions. These clues appear in places where no one expected signs of human life. They revealed that the boundaries between ancient land and sea were nothing like the ones we know. Imagine a family living in a settlement near a river delta 15,000 years ago. Their homes built from wood and reed, their tools crafted from stone, their days centered around fishing, foraging, and the rhythms of seasonal movement. For generations, their ancestors had watched the river swell and recede. They relied on its patterns. But then the waterline began to rise year after year, slowly enough that no single season felt catastrophic, but persistently enough that each generation noticed changes. Fields that had once been dry began to flood more frequently. Fishing spots shifted inland. Trees that stood for centuries began to die from waterlogged roots. The ground softened. The landscape blurred. The people living there might not have had the language to describe what was happening in geological terms, but they felt it in their daily routines. Eventually, they had to move, not because of a single disaster, but because the world they understood was slowly becoming uninhabitable. And when they left, they took their memories, their tools, and their knowledge with them. But their homes remained behind. Over time, the rising waters swallowed everything. Whatever they built dissolved into the sediment. Their histories slipped quietly out of reach. This pattern repeated around the world. In some places, sea levels rose quickly due to rapid glacial melting. In others, land subsided as the weight of ice sheets lifted, changing the shape of the shoreline even before the water arrived. Some of the earliest human migrations followed the retreating coastline, resulting in groups moving thousands of kilometers over generations. Others moved only short distances, shifting from one environment to another again and again. The rise of the seas did more than drown settlements. It reshaped ecosystems. Fish species moved into newly formed coastal waters. Plants adapted to brackish environments. Animals migrated inland. Humans who stayed near the coasts had to develop new methods of fishing, new styles of shelter, and new strategies for navigating unfamiliar landscapes. Those who moved inland had to adapt to different resources, different climates, and different interactions with neighboring groups. The long-term effects of rising seas reached far beyond the physical landscape. Cultural practices changed. Belief systems evolved as people encountered new environments. Knowledge that made sense in one region became less useful in another. Groups developed different techniques for food storage, tool creation, and navigation. Over time, these shifts contributed to cultural diversity across continents. And in many cases, the original coastal societies that sparked these innovations became untraceable. There are underwater landscapes today that preserve evidence of these ancient worlds better than any dry site ever could. When sea levels rise slowly, they sometimes bury everything in layers of silt that protect objects from oxygen decay. Under such conditions, wooden artifacts survive. Seeds remain intact. Even footprints can be preserved in sediment that later hardens beneath the weight of water. But these submerged records are hard to reach. They require advanced diving, specialized equipment, and sometimes sheer luck. And even when evidence is found, it represents only a tiny part of a much larger picture. Many cultures around the world have stories about floods, rising waters, and lands disappearing beneath the sea. These stories aren't identical. Each culture describes the event in its own way. But the common theme suggests that memories of ancient sea level rise may have passed through generations, long enough to become part of myth. These stories don't provide scientific detail, but they capture the emotional impact of losing land, homes, and familiar surroundings. They remind us that rising seas weren't just a geological phenomenon. They were a human experience that shaped identity, memory, and cultural continuity. In some regions, entire land bridges once connected continents. For example, areas that were dry land in ancient times now sit beneath shallow waters between countries or islands. These land bridges allowed people, animals, and plants to migrate across vast areas. When the seas rose, these connections vanished. Groups that once interacted regularly became isolated. Their cultures diverged. Their languages changed. Their technologies developed independently. Some became distinct enough that their shared origins were forgotten. The loss of these bridges wasn't dramatic in the moment, but the long-term consequences were enormous. The rising seas didn't only separate people, they also created new coastal environments that attracted settlement for thousands of years afterward. As shorelines stabilized, early communities adapted to the new conditions. Fishing became more productive. Marine resources expanded. River deltas formed fertile regions that encouraged the growth of agriculture later on. In this way, the very force that erased older societies laid the groundwork for new ones. But between those eras of destruction and creation lies a long stretch of silence. This silence isn't just the absence of sound. It's the absence of written records, the absence of monuments, the absence of visible structures. It's the absence of names, stories, and identities. When the seas took those landscapes, they took the details with them. All that remains now are the faintest impressions scattered across ocean floors or hidden beneath layers of sediment. It's important to remember that the people who lived through this didn't see themselves as lost. They weren't primitive or isolated. They were living fully within the world they understood. They made choices based on the knowledge they had. They developed technologies appropriate to their environment. They built communities that lasted for generations. The disappearance is not a sign of failure. It's a sign of how dynamic the planet is. When we consider how many times humanity has reset itself, rising seas form one of the clearest examples. These weren't resets caused by internal collapse or conflict. They were environmental shifts that reshaped the world humans lived in. The people who survived adapted, moved, and rebuilt. The people who didn't survive left traces that help us understand the magnitude of these changes. And the societies that followed inherited a world very different from the one their ancestors knew. As the seas rose, they covered coastlines that had once been central to human life. Countless generations of knowledge became disconnected from their original context. Techniques for navigating those landscapes no longer applied. Traditions tied to specific rivers, hills, or fishing grounds couldn't continue. Yet other traditions emerged, shaped by the new coastline. People learned to live with tides, estuaries, and shifting shorelines. They developed new strategies for gathering food and managing water. They built new settlements farther inland or along newly formed coasts. Their resilience carried forward even as their history sank beneath the waves. These underwater histories remind us that the world we see today is only the current version of a constantly shifting landscape. The continents haven't always looked like this. The oceans haven't always stopped where they do now. Our understanding of human history is shaped by what remains visible, and rising seas ensure that enormous parts of that history are out of reach. But knowing that these places existed, even if we can't recover everything about them, adds depth to our understanding of humanity's past. The movement of the seas didn't only change coastlines, it reshaped climate patterns. Warmer oceans altered weather, influencing rainfall, storms, and temperatures across continents. These changes in turn shaped vegetation, animal distribution, and the resources available to human groups. Every shift in climate triggered new adaptations. Every adaptation became part of the larger story of humanity's resilience. Some of the earliest signs of complex human behavior may lie beneath the ocean. The first experiments in building permanent shelters, the first organized hunting routes, the first signs of community cooperation. But until underwater archaeology expands enough to recover these stories, they remain part of the silence. And that silence carries a certain weight, not of emptiness, but of possibility. It reminds us that our knowledge is incomplete, not because the past lacked complexity, but because time and the shifting earth transform those histories into something we can only glimpse. Rising seas also influence the spread of languages, technologies, and cultural practices. When groups relocated, they brought their knowledge with them, but they also blended that knowledge with what they found in new environments or among neighboring groups. These blends created new traditions that are difficult to trace back to their origins. What seems like an isolated innovation may have been carried from a coastal society, long lost to the ocean. The quiet erasure of these landscapes doesn't diminish their importance. It simply shifts how we understand the past. Instead of seeing human history as a single, continuous line leading to modern civilization, we begin to see it as a mosaic. Some pieces are bright and well preserved. Others are faded or missing, but together they form a larger picture of a species that has continually adapted to change. The rise of the seas was one of humanity's largest shared experiences, unfolding slowly enough to shape generations, but significantly enough to alter the map of the world. It didn't destroy humanity. It didn't erase every civilization, but it did force countless resets, encouraging new ways of living and thinking. And as these shifts accumulated over millennia, they prepared humanity for the next transitions, the next experiments in survival, the next attempts to build societies, and the next steps in the long path that eventually led toward the civilizations we know. When we talk about humanity surviving difficult periods, it's easy to focus on dramatic images of fire, floods, storms, or shifting coastlines. Those changes leave marks on the land. They leave ruins, layers of sediment, and sometimes entire landscapes hidden underwater. But there's another kind of reset that doesn't leave obvious traces in the environment. It leaves traces inside us instead. Long ago, at a time when the world looked very different, humanity passed through a narrow doorway of survival, a genetic bottleneck so significant that nearly every person alive today carries the signature of it. It wasn't a moment anyone recorded. There were no written accounts, no monuments describing the journey, and no stories carved into stone. But its impact is so deep that it shapes the structure of modern humanity in ways most people never realize. To understand what happened, it helps to imagine the world before this bottleneck. Humans were already spread across Africa and regions beyond it, forming small groups that lived according to the rhythms of their environments. These groups weren't enormous or densely populated. They were small communities tied together through family cooperation and shared knowledge. They hunted, gathered, crafted tools, used fire, moved seasonally, and lived within natural cycles. But they were numerous enough, collectively, that humanity, as a whole, had a healthy level of genetic diversity. Variations that arise naturally in large populations over time. And then something changed. It's not entirely clear what the triggering event was, because the Earth didn't leave a neat clue. It could have been a drastic climate shift, It could have been a series of volcanic eruptions. It could have been disease, competition with other hominin species, changes in food availability, or a combination of many factors happening at once. Whatever the cause, the number of humans dropped sharply. So sharply that scientists today can detect the reduction just by examining the genetic variation in modern populations. Genetics works a bit like a library. The more people in a population, the more books of genetic information there are, filled with variations shaped by countless ancestors. When the population shrinks dramatically, many of those books are lost. Only the variations carried by the surviving individuals continue forward. Over many generations, their descendants repopulate the world, but the genetic diversity remains lower than before. This is what we call a bottleneck, a narrow point through which the entire species must pass before expanding again. In the case of humans, this narrowing was extreme. Some research suggests that our species may have declined to a population of only a few thousand individuals at one point, possibly even fewer. Others proposed that humanity may have been divided into small, isolated groups, each one struggling to survive in different pockets of the landscape. These groups weren't necessarily in direct contact with one another. Each could have been dealing with its own set of challenges: drought in one region, cooling temperatures in another, changing animal migration somewhere else. During this time, human survival relied heavily on the adaptability that had been developing over many thousands of years. Fire, clothing, shelter, and social cooperation were no longer advantages. They were necessities. Groups that had learned to use fire effectively could stay warm when temperatures dropped, or cook food when resources became scarce. Groups that had strong social bonds could share resources, teach skills more effectively, and look after vulnerable members. Groups that understood their environment deeply, its cycles, patterns, and hidden resources, could make decisions that increased their chances of lasting through the most difficult seasons. Imagine a family living through this period. Their daily lives defined not by what they wanted, but by what the climate allowed. If temperatures dropped suddenly, they needed to find shelter quickly. If animals migrated unpredictably, they had to adjust their hunting strategies. If drought lasted longer than usual, they had to move to find water, even if the journey was risky. These choices weren't dramatic. They weren't scenes of battle against the elements. They were gradual, persistent adaptations that unfolded slowly, one day at a time. The bottleneck wasn't a single event that occurred in a few years. It likely stretched over thousands of years. Human populations didn't collapse and recover overnight. They dwindled and struggled, with some groups dying out while others managed to hold on. The slow nature of this process makes it difficult to reconstruct with precision. But the genetic evidence is clear enough. At some point, humanity was reduced to a very small number of individuals who survived through a combination of luck, adaptation, and cooperation. What makes this bottleneck so mysterious is how its effects linger. Despite the vast differences we see in human cultures today, differences in language, appearance, tradition, and ways of life, we are remarkably similar genetically. Much more similar than one would expect for a species spread across the entire globe. Some species of animals with far smaller ranges have more genetic variation than humans. This doesn't mean humans are identical. There is still plenty of genetic diversity. But compared to what scientists would expect for a species our size, modern humans look like the descendants of a population that survived by the narrowest of margins. This reduced diversity has influenced how humans adapted to different climates after the bottleneck. When groups began to spread out again, moving into Europe, Asia, the Pacific Islands, and eventually the Americas, they carried only a subset of the variations that existed before. As they encountered new environments, they adapted again. Skin tones shifting in response to sunlight, body structures adjusting to climate, cultural practices supporting survival in deserts, forests, tundras, and mountains. But all of these adaptations began from a smaller genetic foundation than before the bottleneck. This narrowing doesn't mean the surviving humans were stronger, smarter, or more capable. It means they were in the right places, with the right knowledge, and enough cooperation to survive long enough to reproduce. The reasons they survive could be environmental, behavioral, or simply the result of chance. A slightly better shelter here, a slightly warmer fire there, a small group positioned near a reliable water source. Tiny advantages, magnified over generations, can preserve a lineage, even when the odds are difficult. The bottleneck also shaped how humans interacted socially. Small, isolated groups depend heavily on consistent communication, shared decision and collective effort. In these groups, cooperation wasn't a preference. It was essential. People had to rely on each other. Skills needed to be shared. Disagreements had consequences. These pressures may have reinforced the development of language, empathy, social roles, and cooperation. When your group is small enough that every individual matters, you learn to value group stability in ways that shape culture and behavior. Another part of the mystery is that different scientific methods point to slightly different timelines for the bottleneck. Genetic evidence suggests a dramatic reduction tens of thousands of years ago, while archaeological evidence hints at other possible bottlenecks earlier or later. There may not have been just one. Humanity might have passed through several narrow periods, each one leaving its own mark on the population. These would have occurred alongside other resets, climatic shifts, volcanic eruptions, changes in resources, or competition with other hominin species, such as Neanderthals or Denisovans. Some researchers point to a massive volcanic eruption tens of thousands of years ago that might have thrown enough ash into the atmosphere to cause global cooling. This eruption, while not confirmed as the sole cause, could have contributed to population declines, but the exact relationship remains uncertain because humans are adaptable. Some groups may have lived in regions less affected by the cooling. Others may have had access to resources that helped them survive. The uncertainty surrounding the cause doesn't diminish the significance of the bottleneck. Instead, it highlights how complex and overlapping the pressures on early humans were. Climate, landscape, food availability, migration patterns, and interspecies interactions all played roles in shaping human survival. The bottleneck wasn't a single story. It was a combination of many stories, unfolding in different places, influenced by local conditions, but all converging into the same outcome: a drastic reduction in human numbers. What makes this bottleneck particularly fascinating is that it didn't stop human innovation. Even in periods of low population, people continued to create tools, adapt to new conditions, and develop cultural practices. They refined hunting strategies. They learned to create stronger shelters, They made clothing suited for colder climates. They crafted symbolic items, suggesting that meaning and ritual mattered even in times of struggle. This shows that survival isn't only about physical needs. It's also about maintaining a sense of identity, belonging, and continuity. As populations slowly recovered, the descendants of those who survived the bottleneck carried their knowledge into new regions. The early expansions out of Africa, which occurred in waves, were shaped by the genetic and cultural foundations left by bottleneck survivors. These expansions weren't rapid migrations. They unfolded slowly, with small groups exploring new landscapes, following animals, and adapting as they went. Over thousands of years, humans spread across the world. But the genetic imprint of the bottleneck remained at the core of every population. Even as humans spread apart geographically, the bottleneck ensured that they shared a common ancestry. This shared ancestry is why modern humans around the world are more genetically similar than many people expect. Cultural differences emerged later, shaped by environment, adaptation, and social evolution. But the biological foundation traces back to a small number of survivors who weathered one of the most challenging periods humanity ever faced. The mystery of this bottleneck isn't just about how many people survived. It's also about how they did it. The resilience required to persist through such difficult conditions hints at a level of cooperation and adaptability that would later define human societies. The knowledge passed through those surviving groups became the foundation for everything that followed. Exploration, settlement, agriculture, and eventually civilization itself. The bottleneck also reminds us that humanity's current diversity, culture, and innovation emerged not from a stable or abundant past, but from a fragile one. We exist because our ancestors adapted to pressures that could have ended us. They kept going through times when survival was a daily challenge. They held on long enough for conditions to shift, for populations to recover, and for the next chapters of human history to unfold. Certain moments in human history unfold not through dramatic events or overwhelming environmental changes, but through the quieter movements of memory. There have been long stretches of time when knowledge grew steadily, spread through communities, became part of daily life, and then slowly or suddenly slipped away. The story of humanity is not just a progression of ever-increasing understanding. It's a rhythm of discovery and forgetting, of learning something essential and then watching it fade, only to be rediscovered much later as if it were new. This cycle has happened more times than we can count, and its traces appear in every era, from small villages to the largest civilizations. Consider what knowledge actually looks like in everyday life. It isn't just written down in scrolls or etched into tablets. Most knowledge is practical. How to build a shelter, which plants are edible. How to track animals. When to expect certain weather. How to craft a tool from stone. How to make clothing from fibers or hides. These skills emerge from experience. Someone tries something new, sees that it works, teaches the method to others, and before long, the technique becomes part of the community's routine. But routines are fragile. When populations move, when climates shift, or when groups fracture, knowledge requires continuous practice to survive. Without that, even essential skills can disappear. After the long, cold periods that tested humanity so intensely, groups that survived carried forward a collection of insights they had gained from hardship. They had learned to adapt quickly, to observe subtle changes in the landscape, to store food, to travel strategically, and to cooperate through difficult seasons. But as conditions warmed and populations expanded, some of those survival techniques became less necessary. When an idea is no longer required for daily living, it often slips from memory. A technique used for navigating snow-covered terrain becomes irrelevant when the region warms. A specialized hunting strategy becomes obsolete when the animals migrate elsewhere. Over generations, pieces of knowledge quietly fall away. At the same time, new challenges appear. People settle in unfamiliar regions, face different plants, animals, and climates, and slowly build new techniques suited to their environments. This constant shift means the world is full of examples where communities developed knowledge, lost it, and later, sometimes thousands of years later, other communities developed something remarkably similar without knowing it had existed before. This is one of the most repeated patterns in human history: reinvention through necessity. One clear example is the way humans learned to work with certain materials. Early groups around the world figured out how to shape stone into tools long before formal civilizations emerged. The process wasn't written down. It was learned through demonstration. Someone picked up a stone, struck it against another stone, and created a sharper edge. Over time, they refined the technique by observing how different angles produced different shapes. But when groups moved into regions with different types of stone, the old methods didn't always apply. Some techniques were abandoned in favor of new ones. Generations later, in a different place, people rediscover the same principles because the underlying physics remain the same, even if the original teachers had long vanished. Another example appears in early attempts at plant cultivation. Long before farming became widespread, some societies experimented with planting seeds intentionally or managing wild plants by clearing competing vegetation. These early forms of agriculture sometimes thrived for a while, then disappeared due to climate shifts, loss of population, or migrations into regions where those specific plants couldn't grow. Later, entirely different communities in different parts of the world began their own experiments, discovering similar techniques without any connection to the earlier attempts. The idea wasn't passed down. It was reborn in response to similar needs. This pattern isn't limited to tools and agriculture. Human groups have developed forms of counting, record-keeping, navigation, and construction methods that appeared, faded, and reappeared across millennia. A community might develop a reliable way of tracking seasons through the movement of stars, then lose that knowledge if cloud cover increases for decades, or if a group relocates to a region with different visibility. Later, another group might look up, notice new patterns, and develop their own form of sky-based tracking. Both methods serve the same purpose, yet each arises independently. Sometimes knowledge is lost not because people forget it, but because they no longer have the resources to practice it. A society might learn how to construct large structures, but if access to essential materials is cut off by environmental change or migration, the skill becomes dormant. Generations later, when resources become available again, the techniques reappear, either in a familiar form or through rediscovery. Knowledge doesn't always disappear entirely. It often remains in fragments, partial memories, scattered hints, or tools whose original purpose becomes unclear. These remnants can inspire new attempts, guiding people toward rediscovery, even if they don't understand the original methods. There are also cases where knowledge was deliberately simplified because communities needed to reduce the demands on their time or energy. For example, a group might abandon a complex crafting technique if survival requires faster production. Over time, the simplified version becomes the norm, and the original complexity disappears. But in later generations, when the community has more stability, people may begin experimenting again, rediscovering details that had been lost. This ebb and flow of sophistication shows that progress isn't a straight climb. It's a combination of adaptation and memory shaped by immediate needs. The loss of knowledge isn't always accidental. Sometimes it results from population movement. When groups relocate, they often leave behind skills suited to their previous environment. Fishing techniques developed near coastlines may fade when a group moves inland. Methods for storing food in cold climates might disappear when people migrate to warmer regions. Even the shape of tools changes with environment. A particular style of spear might be perfect for hunting in open plains, but impractical in dense forests. Knowledge tied to a location naturally dissolves when the landscape changes. Another cause of lost knowledge is the fragmentation of groups during difficult periods. When a large community splits into smaller ones, each subgroup carries only part of the original knowledge. Over generations, the fragments drift further apart. Some techniques are preserved, others forgotten, and still others transformed into new variations. Later, when groups reconnect, or when new communities arise, their combined knowledge creates something different, blending the old and new in ways that are hard to trace. The mystery deepens when we consider that many early societies had forms of knowledge that modern science only recently rediscovered. For example, some ancient groups had a deep understanding of plant-based medicine, navigation using natural cues, or sustainable farming methods that left few visible traces. These systems worked effectively within their ecosystems. But when the societies declined or moved, the knowledge went with them. Without written records, those insights vanished until new generations facing similar challenges found their own ways to reach the same conclusions. There's a quiet resilience in this cycle. Even when knowledge disappears, humanity has a way of uncovering it again. Sometimes the rediscovery happens through careful observation, sometimes through experimentation, sometimes through necessity. What might appear lost forever can reemerge many centuries later, when conditions create the need for it once again. The process of knowledge being reborn often begins in small ways. Someone notices that a certain plant grows better when the surrounding vegetation is cleared. Someone else experiments with heating a piece of clay and finds that it hardens into something stronger. Another person discovers that a particular type of stone flakes in predictable patterns. These small observations accumulate, spread through conversations, become part of daily routines, and eventually evolve into more complex techniques. Over generations, a rediscovered method becomes established knowledge, even if no one remembers that it existed long before. One of the most striking examples of knowledge reborn comes from early construction techniques. In multiple parts of the world, societies developed similar methods for building stable structures long before they had contact with one another. The idea of aligning buildings with the sun or stars appears in unrelated cultures. Techniques for constructing walls capable of withstanding earthquakes show up in regions separated by oceans. These parallels suggest that humans naturally gravitate towards similar solutions when facing similar problems. It also suggests that even without written communication, certain ideas are almost inevitable, emerging whenever people concentrate effort on understanding the physical world. The cycle of knowledge gained, lost, and reborn also appears in the development of social structures. Early groups experimented with ways of organizing themselves, assigning roles, sharing responsibilities, resolving disputes, and caring for vulnerable members. Some systems worked well and lasted for generations. Others proved too rigid or too fragile and faded quickly. Over time, communities developed new approaches based on changing needs. Many of these social innovations appear multiple times in history, not because one group learned from another, but because humans continually revisit ideas about how to live together. Knowledge is also shaped by crisis. During harsh periods, communities may abandon long-term projects in favor of immediate survival. Artistic expression might slow, ceremonial practices might pause, time-consuming craftsmanship might become impractical. But once stability returns, these practices often reappear because they serve purposes beyond survival. They help people express identity, maintain social bonds, and make sense of their experiences. The re-emergence of such practices shows that knowledge isn't only practical. It also has emotional and cultural value that persists across resets. As humans continued to spread across the world, the cycle of gaining, losing, and rediscovering knowledge shaped the diversity of cultures that developed. A technique perfected in one region might be unknown in another. A method for cultivating a specific plant might disappear in one generation and reappear in another. A tradition might fade in one area, but thrive in a neighboring one. These variations made human societies unique, but they also highlighted the ways in which all humans respond to similar challenges with creativity and curiosity. This cycle is not limited to ancient history. It still happens. There are techniques once used by early societies that only reappeared in modern times when researchers uncovered evidence of them. Some methods for managing soil, preserving seeds, or crafting certain materials aligned closely with practices rediscovered through modern experimentation. When people today look for sustainable ways of living, they sometimes recreate techniques that existed thousands of years ago without realizing it. This shows that knowledge doesn't disappear completely. It lingers in the possibilities of the world itself. What ties this entire cycle together is the way knowledge depends on continuity. It survives when people teach their children, when communities maintain traditions, when the environment remains stable enough for certain practices to remain useful. It fades when those conditions change. But even when it fades, humans retain the ability to rediscover it because the world still offers the same principles, materials, and patterns. As we continue exploring the story of humanity's resets, the cycle of knowledge becomes a thread that connects each era. The people who survived harsh climates carried forward insights that helped future generations. The groups who lived through rising seas preserved skills that later societies would need in different forms. And the knowledge that vanished during difficult times often returned later, reshaped by new environments and new challenges across many regions of the world. Whenever researchers study early stories told by ancient communities, they begin to notice patterns that appear again and again. These patterns show up in places separated by oceans, mountains, and entire continents, even among groups who never exchange written records. People from different eras described events that sound strangely similar: great darkness, long winters, floods that swallowed familiar lands, fires that raged across the sky, or migration sparked by forces they couldn't control. At first glance, these stories look like simple myth. But when we look more closely, they reveal something deeper. They echo real events, resets that shaped humanity, but left only faint scientific traces and vivid cultural memories. To understand why so many different societies developed similar stories, it helps to consider how humans have always made sense of the world. Before written language, before detailed historical accounts, people explained events through narrative. A story told around a fire could preserve a warning or a memory far longer than a technical explanation. The past didn't need to be precise. It needed to feel true enough to guide future generations. Over time, these stories evolved, changed with each retelling, and adapted to the needs of the community. What began as a description of a difficult season could transform into a tale passed down for thousands of years. When we examine these stories through the lens of early resets, the connections become clearer. Many myths about floods, for example, may originate from the rising seas that reshaped coastlines long before any civilization recorded the changes. Communities living along the edges of rivers, lakes, or early coastlines would have seen their lands slowly disappear. They would have moved away, leaving behind memories that turned into stories, spoken to children who never saw the old landscapes. Generations later, the details softened while the core meaning survived. The world once changed in a way that overwhelmed everything familiar. Some groups described these events as punishments from the sky. Others saw them as demonstrations of nature's power. The interpretations varied, but the root experience may have been the same. Land lost to water, resources shifting, and families forced to move. Over time, the story became a myth, not because it was untrue, but because it no longer matched the current landscape. When people looked around and saw stable coastlines, the idea of rising waters seemed too distant to explain literally, and so it was remembered symbolically. Stories about darkness and cold may point to periods of dramatic climate change. Long winters appear not only in regions prone to harsh weather, but also in areas where ancient climate patterns suggest sudden cooling. If a volcanic eruption reduced sunlight across wide areas, generations living through the aftermath would have struggled to describe the experience using only the language and knowledge available to them. They might speak of a sky that dimmed unexpectedly or seasons that stretched longer than they should. These details became oral histories, passed down long after the direct, physical evidence faded. Similarly, myths of fire descending from the sky could reflect memories of meteor showers, volcanic ash glowing in the atmosphere, or lightning-driven wildfires that spread across landscapes not accustomed to widespread burning. A dramatic natural event becomes easier to remember when wrapped in a compelling story. If people needed to teach their children to stay cautious during certain environmental conditions, a myth could do the work of preserving a lesson without requiring precise scientific details. The presence of these similarities across widely separated cultures raises an interesting question. How much of our ancient memory is embedded in myth? Some researchers propose that humans carry a form of inherited cultural memory, not through genetic inheritance, but through repeated storytelling patterns that survive longer than any physical record. When a story resonates strongly, it persists. It may change shape, but its core survives transitions, migrations, and resets. This pattern becomes particularly clear when examining stories about migration. Many cultures describe ancestral journeys prompted by environmental changes. Some speak of leaving ancestral homelands due to drought. Others recall long travels triggered by changing animal migrations or shrinking resources. These stories often match what we know from archaeology about population movements. People didn't move randomly. They followed patterns influenced by climate, food availability, and environmental shifts. Their stories preserve emotional truths that align with what science has uncovered about early human movement. Not every myth reflects a real event, though. Some stories emerged purely from imagination or from attempts to explain natural phenomena without any historical foundation. But even these tales can hint at how people experience their environment. They reflect fears, hopes, and observations. In this way, myths act as cultural markers that connect us to the mindset of early humans, helping us understand how they processed resets that altered their world. One of the most intriguing aspects of myth is how it compresses time. An event that unfolded over centuries becomes a story lasting only a few minutes. Generations of gradual change become a single, dramatic moment. This compression doesn't erase the truth behind the story. It makes it easier to pass along. When a land bridge slowly submerged over hundreds of years, a community might remember it as a single event, the day the sea came in. The reality was slow, but the memory captured the essential truth. The world changed, and people had to move. Some myths describe the earth shaking or the ground opening. These may echo memories of earthquakes or volcanic activity. Even minor seismic events can leave strong impressions when they disrupt daily life. Over time, the story becomes part of a culture's explanation for why certain landscapes look the way they do. They might not know the geological details, but they remember the disruption. These memories can survive long enough to become recognized by later scientists, who match them with evidence of ancient seismic activity. The power of myth also lies in its ability to preserve emotional responses. People who lived through early resets didn't just experience physical changes. They dealt with fear, uncertainty, and the challenge of adapting to unfamiliar conditions. When they told stories about these changes, they added emotional weight. Their children inherited not only the information, but also the tone. Through this process, myths can preserve the psychological impact of resets, even when the physical evidence is gone. One notable aspect of myth is the presence of stories about beings who came before humans, or who taught early humans essential skills. While these figures are not literal, they may represent memories of earlier groups, older cultures, or ancestors whose knowledge once shaped the community. For example, a story about a wise figure teaching people how to use fire might preserve the memory of a real moment when fire use first spread through a region. The figure becomes symbolic, but the knowledge they represent reflects real historical change. As societies grew more complex, myths expanded. They incorporated social values, laws, moral lessons, and explanations for natural processes. But beneath these layers, some stories retained elements of ancient resets. Floods, fires, migrations, and long winters didn't vanish from narrative. They remained embedded in cultural foundations, showing that the earliest human experiences continued to influence later generations. This persistence demonstrates how deeply resets shape identity. It's important to note that myth does not provide exact historical timelines. It doesn't tell us precise dates, names, or locations. Instead, it offers patterns. And when those patterns align across continents, they hint at shared experiences rooted in actual events. Researchers don't rely solely on myth to reconstruct history, but they compare myths with geological, climatic, and archaeological data. When the stories and the science point in the same direction, a clearer picture emerges. For example, myths of a great flood appear on nearly every continent. They differ in detail, but the common theme is overwhelming water transforming the land. When combined with evidence of ancient sea level rise, these stories gain context. Myths of a long night or prolonged darkness appear in multiple regions. When aligned with evidence of volcanic eruptions that caused atmospheric dimming, they gain further meaning. These connections show that myths are more than entertainment. They are archives, keeping fragments of resets alive long after the physical evidence fades. The presence of these myths also helps us understand how humans cope with change. When people experience events beyond their control, they make sense of them through narrative. These narratives become frameworks for interpreting future events. When a community moved due to rising seas, the story helped explain to later generations why their ancestors left. When a drought forced migration, the story warned future generations about the importance of resource management. Myth served as a practical tool for survival, giving meaning to events that might otherwise be overwhelming. Another important function of myth is preserving lessons. Even if the original event is forgotten, the lesson remains. A story about a flood may include warnings about building too close to water. A story about fire may carry guidance about handling tools safely. A story about dark skies may reinforce the importance of preparation. These lessons become part of cultural identity, teaching future generations how to respond when similar challenges arise. In this way, myths contain resets not just as memories, but as guidance. They show that humanity has always used stories to prepare for uncertainty. Instead of relying solely on observation, people turned wisdom into narratives. These narratives helped communities adapt more effectively when facing similar situations. As resets accumulated, myths grew richer. Each generation added details based on their own challenges. Some stories merged, others diverged. The result is tapestry of narratives that reflect both ancient experiences and ongoing adaptation. When we read myths today, we see echoes of countless resets, some environmental, some social, some technological. They stretch across time, connecting early human experiences to later civilizations. These stories also reveal how humans perceive continuity. Even when a civilization fell or a landscape changed, the stories persisted. This persistence gave communities a sense of stability despite change. It allowed people to feel connected to ancestors long gone, creating a chain of meaning that extended across generations. In this way, myths acted as bridges between past resets and future challenges. They carried the memory of what came before, helping people prepare for what might come next. Understanding the resets hidden in myth and memory broadens our view of human history. It reminds us that early humans were not lost or confused. They observed their world carefully and created systems for preserving essential information. Their stories were tools for survival. And even though the details may be wrapped in symbolism or shaped by imagination, the core truths remain relevant. They show that adaptation, awareness, and resilience have always been part of humanity's story. With these echoes of the past carried through narrative, we can see how the next chapters of human history unfolded not through myth alone, but through the gradual return of stability, the rebuilding of communities, and the continual rediscovery of ideas shaped by all the resets that came before. Some parts of human history reveal themselves not through discovery, not through exploration, and not even through survival, but through moments where humanity nearly brought itself to a halt. When people think about existential danger, they often picture meteors, floods, or towering volcanic eruptions. But there have been times when the greatest threat to humanity didn't come from outside. It came from us. These moments weren't always dramatic. Some unfolded slowly, shaped by decisions repeated across generations. Others were sudden, shaped by conflict or imbalance. Together, they show how fragile our species has been at different points in time, even after we had already become capable, widespread, and creative in ways earlier ancestors never imagined. A useful place to begin is with the earliest evidence of conflict among human groups. Before people built cities or states, communities were small. They were shaped by shared survival, cooperation, and mutual dependence. But even in those early environments, competition existed. Groups sometimes fought over territory, resources, or hunting grounds. These conflicts were limited by the size of the groups involved. With only dozens of people in a band, the impact of a conflict, although serious, couldn't threaten the entire species. Still, these early tensions planted a seed. Cooperation was essential for survival, but so was defending resources. Humans learned both skills simultaneously. As populations grew and societies became more complex, the potential consequences of conflict grew with them. When a small community struggled, it affected only that group. But when larger societies formed, their collapses or confrontations had broader effects. One of the earliest examples of large-scale danger came from resource exhaustion. Communities that expanded rapidly sometimes consumed resources faster than they could replenish them. Forests cleared for fuel or agriculture might not regrow quickly enough. Soil used too intensely could become infertile. When communities relied heavily on a few key resources, any disruption could escalate into widespread problems. Consider a large settlement built near a vital river or fertile plain. For generations, the people living there rely on predictable patterns of rain, harvest, and seasonal movement. But then the climate shifts slightly. Rainfall changes. The river floods differently. A series of lean harvest appears. In isolation, these shifts might be manageable, but within a dense, growing population, the consequences intensify. Food shortages lead to strain. Strain leads to conflict. Conflict spreads. People begin moving, searching for new land, putting pressure on neighboring societies. A small disruption becomes a wide-reaching reset. These cycles appear repeatedly in early human history. Another danger emerged from the development of powerful social structures. When humans organized into larger societies, roles became more specialized. Leaders held authority. Systems developed for decision, trade, and coordination. These structures made complex civilizations possible, but they also introduced new vulnerabilities. When leadership made poor decisions, the consequences could affect millions. When trade routes faltered, entire economies could collapse. When governments focused on growth without considering long-term sustainability, environmental degradation followed. Some societies collapsed due to overexpansion. They stretched themselves thin, managing lands too vast to control effectively. When disruptions occurred, drought, conflict, disease, they couldn't maintain stability. These collapses weren't just political events. They often led to significant population reductions, as people left cities that could no longer support them. In some cases, the surrounding environment changed so drastically that the region couldn't sustain large populations again for centuries. Disease became another major force of reset once human populations reached greater density. In small groups, an illness might affect several people and then fade because it couldn't spread widely. But in early agricultural societies, dense living conditions allowed diseases to flourish. People lived near domesticated animals, which introduced new pathogens. When communities grew large enough, illnesses could spread rapidly, overwhelming populations. There were outbreaks that killed significant portions of entire regions long before written history documented the details. These early epidemics often reshaped societies without leaving clear physical records. They broke social structures, disrupted trade, and reduced populations dramatically. After each outbreak, populations took generations to recover. The memory of these events faded, becoming part of cultural stories about times of great sickness without the scientific clarity we have today. Humanity also came close to self-inflicted collapse through environmental changes driven by human activity. Deforestation is one example. Large areas once covered in trees were cleared for building materials, fuel, and farmland. Without trees, soil eroded. Rivers changed course. Fertility declined. Some civilizations experienced repeated cycles of expansion and collapse, directly tied to how they managed their environment. These weren't sudden events. They were gradual declines that unfolded across decades or centuries, but ultimately shaped the direction of those societies. Another form of danger came from the pressure placed on animals that early humans depended on. When hunting became too effective, populations of certain species declined. In some regions, the loss of a key animal species forced groups to abandon their settlements, search for new resources, or change their entire way of life. Overhunting didn't threaten the global human population, but it did reshape regional societies countless times. Each shift in available resources set off a chain of decisions that influenced how people lived, moved, and adapted. Calling these events near endings may seem dramatic, but for the people living through them, the world as they knew it was reaching a breaking point. And because societies weren't connected globally the way they are today, a collapse in one region didn't cascade across the entire species. Instead, humanity survived by being diverse. When one area struggled, another thrived. When one society collapsed, another adapted. This distribution protected humanity from a single event, ending the entire species. But it didn't prevent repeated local endings, resets that erased knowledge, disrupted cultural continuity, and forced entire populations to rebuild from earlier stages of development. In later periods, conflict between societies introduced new risks. As groups developed more advanced tools and tactics, the scale of conflict expanded. Weapons became more effective, battlefields larger, consequences broader. In some regions, prolonged warfare contributed directly to societal decline. Resources once used for growth were directed toward conflict. Infrastructure suffered. Trade routes became unsafe. These cascading effects contributed to repeated collapses. Some societies became so weakened by internal conflict that they couldn't withstand environmental changes that might otherwise have been manageable. A drought that could have been survived in stable conditions became catastrophic in a divided society. This combination of internal and external pressures shaped many of the major resets that occurred throughout ancient history. The root cause wasn't just the drought or the conflict, it was their intersection. There were also moments when societies achieved remarkable innovations, but used them in ways that created long-term danger. Early forms of metalworking introduced stronger tools and weapons, but extracting metal required significant resources. Forests were cut to fuel furnaces. Mines disrupted landscapes. Communities dependent on these materials sometimes overexploited their environment. When the local ecosystem could no longer support the demands placed on it, collapse followed. Looking across the long arc of history, it becomes clear that humanity repeatedly walked near the edge of self-inflicted danger. Yet, these moments weren't solely destructive. They also produced opportunities for adaptation. Every collapse forced groups to rethink how they used resources, how they organized themselves, and how they interacted with their environment. In many cases, societies rebuilt with new approaches, learning from previous mistakes, even if they didn't frame it in those terms. These repeated brushes with collapse played a role in shaping cultural practices. Warnings embedded in myth often reflect the consequences of past decisions. A story about a city ruined by greed might preserve memory of resource mismanagement. A story about a mountain that became angry could reflect ancient volcanic activity that disrupted entire regions. The moral layers added later don't erase the possibility that these stories capture real danger faced by earlier generations. One example of near-ending situations comes from early cities built in regions dependent on complex irrigation systems. When these systems worked, they supported large populations, but they required careful maintenance. A single miscalculation could lead to salinization of the soil, making farmland unusable. A shift in a river's path could disrupt the entire system. Societies that relied heavily on these water networks sometimes collapsed when the system failed, forcing large populations to disperse. Another example involves societies that grew rapidly due to access to abundant resources. For several generations, they thrived, but over-reliance on those resources eventually created vulnerabilities. When the resources declined, the society had no backup plan. Combined with external pressures, this led to rapid collapse. These societies left behind ruins that appear grand and sophisticated, but their histories reveal precarious foundations. Diseases introduced through expanding trade networks also created serious risks. Once societies became interconnected, pathogens spread more easily. Early trade routes linked distant regions, and with them came illnesses that populations had no immunity to. These epidemics didn't end humanity, but they caused significant declines in population, contributing to societal weakening. The interconnectedness that supported growth also carried hidden vulnerabilities. During these periods, humanity demonstrated a consistent pattern. People adapted through movement, innovation, or social restructuring. Groups that could shift their strategies survived. Those bound too tightly to rigid systems struggled. This interplay between flexibility and fragility determined which societies endured resets and which faded. Even after writing emerged, offering a way to preserve knowledge across generations, societies remained vulnerable. Written knowledge required stable institutions to maintain it. When those institutions faltered, writing could be lost, libraries burned, records decayed, scholars displaced. This meant that even cultures with sophisticated knowledge systems could lose essential information. In several cases, societies emerged centuries later with less knowledge than their predecessors. They had to rebuild, repeating discoveries made long before. Looking at these patterns, it becomes clear that humanity came close to ending itself, not through a single dramatic moment, but through accumulated pressures. Floods or droughts alone were manageable. Conflict alone was manageable. Disease alone was manageable. But when these forces combined with fragile social or environmental systems, the result could be devastating. These combinations produced the resets that shaped human history. Yet despite these risks, humanity continued moving forward, not in a steady upward line, but in cycles of growth, contraction, adaptation, and transformation. Each reset cleared space for new ideas, new systems, and new ways of living. People learned, even if they didn't consciously preserve the lessons. A community that survived famine might develop new agricultural strategies. A society recovering from conflict might strengthen systems of cooperation. These adjustments became the seeds of future resilience. Understanding how close humanity came to ending itself provides context for the later eras of human history. It explains why some societies focused on balance, why others emphasized expansion, and why many developed complex cultural systems aimed at preventing past mistakes. These choices weren't random. They were shaped by generations who lived through danger and understood its consequences. In looking at the long arc of human history, it's tempting to treat resets as something that happened far away in time. Ancient collapses, lost worlds beneath rising seas, drastic climate shifts, population bottlenecks, forgotten civilizations, and the rediscovery of knowledge all feel safely distant. But when we shift our attention towards the present, a different realization begins to take shape. Resets aren't only events buried under layers of soil or hidden in genetic history. Some of them are still unfolding. They don't always appear as sudden breaks. They sometimes develop slowly the way earlier resets did through changes in environment, technology, social structure, and behavior. When we look closely at how the world is changing now, the question isn't whether humanity might face another reset someday. The question is whether we are already in the middle of one. A helpful way to approach this idea is to consider what a reset looks like from the inside. Ancient people didn't stand at the beginning of a collapse and label it as such. They reacted to the conditions in front of them. When rivers dried, they moved. When food grew scarce, they changed their strategies. When technologies failed, they adapted or replaced them. The shift became visible only in hindsight. In the moment, it felt like a series of adjustments made in response to challenges. Something similar may be happening now. The signs aren't identical to past resets, but the patterns echo earlier ones in ways that are difficult to ignore. One modern pattern that stands out is the speed of change. In earlier eras, shifts unfolded slowly enough for generations to adapt. A coastline moved over centuries. A climate cooled over thousands of years. A technology spread gradually through small communities. Today, changes that once took centuries can happen within decades. Human societies are tightly connected. A shift in one region affects people on the other side of the world. This interconnection creates resilience in some ways, but also introduces new vulnerabilities. It means that when one part of the system changes rapidly, the ripple effects travel far and quickly. Consider the changes in technology that have unfolded in the last few generations. Knowledge that once took lifetimes to gather can now be accessed instantly. Tools that once required specialized training have become common. The ways we communicate, work, store information, and move across the world have transformed at a pace unmatched in human history. This transformation has improved lives in many ways, but it also introduces instability. A society built on rapidly changing technology must constantly adjust. Skills that were essential a decade ago may become outdated today. Entire industries form and disappear within a single generation. This rapid turnover can resemble the pattern of knowledge cycling through gain, loss, and rebirth that shaped earlier eras. What's different now is that the cycle is compressed. People learn a method, apply it, and then move on to something new before the method fully integrates into stable routine. Knowledge doesn't disappear in the same way it did before, but it becomes less relevant just as quickly. As a result, communities experience a kind of ongoing reset in how they understand the world and how they interact with it. Another modern pattern resembles the environmental pressures that once forced ancient groups to move or adapt. While the climate shifts of the past were natural processes, today's environmental changes involve both natural cycles and human-driven impacts. Regions that once supported stable populations are experiencing different weather patterns. Some areas face increasing drought, others more frequent storms, and others gradual changes that shift the availability of resources. None of these changes occur overnight, but they unfold quickly enough that adaptation becomes a central feature of modern life. The environment is not the only place where resets appear. Social structures experience their own transformations. As populations grow and as connections between cultures expand, ideas spread faster than they once did. This exchange can lead to innovation, but it can also create tension. Systems built for smaller, slower communities must now support larger, rapidly shifting ones. People navigate values, beliefs, and expectations that evolve at a pace earlier societies never encountered. When the structure shifts faster than the population can adjust, it resembles the pressures faced by civilizations that once stretched themselves thin. Economic systems also undergo cycles that mirror earlier resets. Periods of expansion lead to periods of contraction. Resources concentrated in certain regions shift in availability. Technological advances disrupt established patterns of work and production. These cycles are not identical to the collapses of the past, but they share a similar structure. When a system depends heavily on a particular resource or pattern, any disruption can create instability. The difference today is scale. Disruptions can affect millions or billions of people rather than a single region. Another important factor in considering whether humanity is undergoing a reset is the flow of information. In ancient societies, information moved slowly. Stories spread over generations. Decisions were shaped by local knowledge. Today, information spreads instantly, creating rapid shifts in opinion, behavior, and expectation. This creates opportunities for coordination, but also creates volatility. When large populations shift direction quickly, entire systems must adjust at once. Rapid shifts have the potential to generate unintended consequences. If humanity is in the process of resetting, the transformation does not necessarily signal collapse. A reset does not have to mean the end of everything familiar. In earlier eras, resets often cleared the way for new forms of society. They encouraged fresh adaptations, new technologies, and different structures. The idea that humanity is resetting now simply suggests that we're living through a moment of rapid change, shaped by pressures old and new, unfolding simultaneously in ways that demand new approaches. To understand this potential reset more clearly, it helps to compare it to earlier patterns. When ancient societies faced environmental change, they adapted by moving, reorganizing, or shifting their focus. Today, adaptation can take different forms. We don't rely solely on physical movement anymore. We adjust through technology, policy, and changes in behavior. For example, new methods of energy production or new ways of managing resources echo the adjustments ancient societies made when their environment shifted. These innovations don't eliminate the pressure, but they help communities navigate it. Looking at communication, earlier resets often included the loss or transformation of knowledge when societies changed. Today, knowledge can be preserved more effectively due to digital storage and global communication. But this preservation comes with a new challenge. When information becomes abundant, distinguishing what's useful or accurate can become harder. This introduces another form of instability. Too much information can be as challenging as too little. Communities must develop new methods for filtering, understanding, and applying knowledge, similar to how earlier societies had to rebuild their information systems after disruptions. Social systems experience similar pressures. As communities become more interconnected, cultures blend, influence each other, and reshape expectations. This blending sometimes creates strain, but it also leads to new forms of cooperation. In earlier eras, groups that adapted socially were more likely to survive periods of change. Today, the same principle applies. Flexibility and social structures help societies navigate transitions more effectively. When we examine these patterns collectively, a picture emerges of a species undergoing continuous adjustments. Some of these adjustments come from external pressures. Others come from internal dynamics. None of them act alone. The interaction among environment, technology, social structure, information flow, and global connectivity creates a complex environment where small changes can ripple outward quickly. This interconnectedness is new compared to earlier resets. Ancient groups often face challenges independently. A drought in one region didn't necessarily affect people thousands of miles away. Now global systems mean that a shift in one place can influence countless others. This interconnected world behaves differently from the fragmented world of the past. But even with that difference, the underlying pattern remains familiar. Pressure builds, systems adjust, knowledge changes, and new forms of stability eventually emerge. Another aspect of modern life that resembles earlier resets is the pace at which cultural expectations evolve. In ancient societies, cultural change often accompanied environmental or technological shifts. When people moved, their traditions changed. When resources shifted, their values shifted. Today, cultural change occurs through exposure to a wide variety of ideas, practices, and experiences. Can people re-evaluate their roles, identities, and relationships at a pace that can feel disorienting? This cultural adaptation is part of the larger reset, one shaped not by survival alone, but by a rethinking of how people fit within their societies. Economic transitions also contribute to the sense of ongoing shift. Earlier populations had simpler economic systems that adapted slowly. Modern systems adapt rapidly. Often driven by technological innovation, entire industries rise and fall within a generation. Jobs that once defined identity or stability may disappear due to automation or changes in demand. This creates uncertainty, but it also opens space for new forms of work. The cycle resembles earlier resets in which societies reorganize themselves after major changes in resource availability. It's important to acknowledge that not all aspects of the modern world signal danger. Many developments show resilience. Advances in medicine, communication, and education provide tools for navigating change more effectively. Global cooperation offers ways to address challenges collectively. These strengths didn't exist in ancient resets. They reflect a species that has accumulated knowledge across countless cycles of adaptation. Still, the presence of resilience doesn't eliminate the process of resetting. It simply means that humanity has new tools for managing it. A reset today doesn't look like the abrupt collapse of an isolated civilization. It looks like a complex web of changes interacting across many layers of society. People adjust their habits. Communities rethink their priorities. Institutions adapt their structures. Knowledge grows and transforms. This is not collapse. It's evolution shaped by pressure. When viewed through this lens, it becomes clear that resets aren't rare events. They're part of the rhythm of human existence. Every new technology, every cultural shift, every environmental change contributes to the way humanity reinvents itself. The difference now is scale and speed, but the underlying processes remain connected to the same instincts that guided earlier humans: the drive to adapt, to survive, and to create meaning within changing conditions. If we accept that humanity may be in the middle of a reset, the next question is, what emerges afterward? Earlier resets produced new forms of society, new technologies, and new ways of living. The same will likely be true now. The outcomes are not predetermined. They depend on decisions made collectively and individually. They depend on resilience, cooperation, understanding, and the ability to learn from both past and present. There comes a point in any long exploration of human history when the focus naturally shifts after moving through countless resets, near collapses, forgotten worlds, sudden shifts in climate, lost knowledge, and quiet recoveries. It becomes useful to pause, not to conclude anything, but to steady the perspective and see what has carried humanity forward through all of it. When we set aside the details of each era and look instead at what stayed with us, patterns begin to appear. They aren't dramatic, they aren't loud, they don't demand attention, but they are there in every age, guiding people through disruptions they didn't always understand. These patterns reveal something about what survives, even when the world changes in ways that force societies to rebuild from the ground up. One of the clearest things that endures across resets is human cooperation. The earliest groups depended on each other for survival. They shared food, taught skills, and protected one another. When conditions changed through cold periods, migrations, or environmental pressures, cooperation made the difference between groups that survived and groups that faded. Even when populations dwindled to small numbers, the basic pattern persisted. People formed bonds, relied on shared work, and created systems to support each other. This wasn't a coordinated strategy. It was a natural response to the demands of survival. Cooperation isn't something humanity invented during civilization. It is something humans carried with them long before written records and long after societies changed. Another enduring element is the drive to understand the world. Early humans observed patterns in nature, even without scientific terminology. They noticed animal migrations, seasonal changes, and the movement of the sky. They experimented with tools, fire, plants, and shelter. This curiosity continued through every reset. Even when knowledge was lost, the desire to rediscover it remained. People didn't stop asking questions just because a society collapsed. They approached new environments with the same instinct to observe, test, and learn. This drive shaped each recovery, pushing communities to rebuild, not exactly as before, but in ways adapted to the new world they found themselves in. We also see continuity in the way humans maintain social memory. Whether through oral traditions, carved images, early writing, or modern records, people have always preserved pieces of their experiences. Stories became a method of carrying insight across generations. Even when the factual details of an event faded, the emotional meaning persisted. Myths that survived for thousands of years were often rooted in real challenges or transformations. Communities didn't have to remember every detail of a reset to remember what mattered. They held on to lessons, warnings, and reflections in forms that could endure through time. There is also remarkable consistency in how humans adapt their surroundings. From shaping stone tools to building shelters suited to specific landscapes, early groups developed ways to make their environments more livable. Later societies expanded this instinct into agriculture, water management, and construction. Even when large civilizations collapsed, the next groups often reused the foundations or ideas left behind, reshaping them into new forms. Adaptation wasn't limited to material objects. It extended into social systems, belief structures, and daily routines. People found ways to adjust their habits when conditions changed. And those adjustments often became part of the cultural fabric passed on to future generations. Another pattern that persists across resets is the way humans respond to uncertainty. Whether facing floods, droughts, migrations, or unfamiliar environments, societies developed frameworks to help people manage the unknown. Sometimes these frameworks were practical, building reserves of food, developing new tools, organizing communal work. Other times they took the form of cultural practices, rituals, or shared meanings that provided psychological stability. Even groups facing extreme pressure found ways to create continuity using traditions and shared narratives to give structure to their experiences. Innovation is another constant thread. Despite setbacks, people continue to create new tools, new strategies, and new systems. Even when populations were small and resources limited, they found ways to improve their circumstances. This wasn't always dramatic. Often, it was gradual experimentation that strengthened the ability of communities to survive. Innovations didn't always spread quickly. Sometimes they were lost and rediscovered later, but the instinct to refine and improve remained stable across every era, contributing to humanity's resilience. If we look closely, another enduring element appears in the way humans form meaningful relationships with the land they inhabit. Early societies developed detailed knowledge of their local environments. They understood plants, animals, weather patterns, and the movement of water. They learned which areas were safe and which were risky. When they were forced to move due to environmental changes, they repeated this process in each new location. Over time, this created a deep tradition of environmental awareness that persisted in different forms across cultures. Even in modern times, this relationship continues, though expressed through different tools and systems. The instinct to study surroundings and adapt accordingly is as old as the species itself. A steady pattern also appears in humanity's methods of rebuilding after loss. When knowledge vanished due to collapse or migration, communities didn't remain stagnant. They rebuilt tools, techniques, and systems in response to immediate needs. These rebuilding periods often produced new combinations of ideas. What survived from the past blended with what conditions demanded, creating fresh forms of knowledge. This is how agriculture spread, how new styles of tools emerged, and how communities developed distinct cultural identities after resets. Rebuilding wasn't simply restoration. It was reinvention shaped by the resilience people carried with them. We also see continuity in the way humans seek connection beyond their immediate groups. Even early societies maintained networks of exchange, sharing materials, knowledge, and cultural practices across long distances. These networks grew and shrank depending on conditions, but consistently reappeared after resets. When a society collapsed and people dispersed and new networks formed, this pattern suggests that connecting with others is a stable part of human behavior, not a development limited to modern civilization. Cooperation within groups ensured survival, and connection across groups enriched knowledge and resilience. Another enduring quality is humanity's capacity for problem solving. In periods of scarcity, people developed new methods of hunting, gathering, crafting, or storing food. In periods of conflict, they created strategies for negotiation, defense, or alliance. In periods of environmental stress, they modified their shelters, tools, and daily routines. These problem-solving habits carried forward even when historical knowledge didn't. They became embedded in the way people approach challenges. The specifics changed, but the underlying instinct remained. We also find consistency in how humans create meaning. Even when societies were small and isolated, they developed ways to understand their experiences. They created symbols, rituals, and shared stories that helped them interpret events, connect with each other, and maintain social cohesion. This meaning-making wasn't limited to any particular culture or era. It appeared in different forms across every region studied. These practices helped people cope with change and uncertainty, providing emotional stability during periods of transformation. Human adaptability is another unbroken thread across all resets, whether caused by climate shifts, population changes, resource pressures, or internal challenges. Humans adjusted. They changed settlement patterns, food strategies, social structures, and technologies. This adaptability doesn't appear as a single trait. It shows itself in countless small decisions made every day. Early societies didn't survive because they predicted every challenge. They survived because they could adjust to challenges they didn't predict. What also endures is the tendency to blend continuity with change. When societies rebuilt, they rarely abandoned everything from the past. They kept what still served them, modified what needed to evolve, and abandoned what no longer worked. This selective approach helped maintain stability while allowing growth. It allowed traditions to persist even during periods of upheaval. This blending of old and new is evident in every era, from early hunter-gatherer groups to complex civilizations. It continues in modern societies as well. Another persistent theme is the way humanity responds to collective memory. Even when specific events fade, the lessons embedded in stories and practices remain. Myths about floods, darkness, or migrations carry the essence of earlier resets. Traditions that encourage cooperation, resource management, or caution during unpredictable seasons reflect long-standing responses to environmental pressure. These forms of memory aren't historical records. They're functional legacies that help communities navigate the world, even when they don't realize where the lessons came from. It's also clear that humanity's sense of identity endures through resets. People find ways to define themselves despite changing conditions. This identity might be tied to place, community, language, or belief. Even when groups disperse or merge with others, they create new identities that help them maintain continuity. Identity evolves, but the instinct to hold on to something stable remains constant. When we consider all these enduring patterns together, a picture of human resilience becomes more visible. Resets did not erase these qualities. They shaped them. Each area of refined cooperation, problem-solving, memory, meaning-making, and adaptability. These qualities strengthened across generations, allowing humanity to face new challenges with the accumulated experience of many past transformations. Another part of what endures is the sense of curiosity that drives people to explore what lies beyond the familiar. Early humans followed rivers, coastlines, and animal migrations into unknown territories. They crossed mountains, deserts, and oceans long before they had maps or advanced tools. This exploration wasn't just about survival. It was driven by a desire to understand what lay beyond. Even after resets that forced communities to withdraw into smaller regions, the instinct to explore eventually returned. Over time, exploration led to the spread of knowledge, the mixing of cultures, and the development of new ideas. This curiosity remains one of the strongest threads connecting ancient humans with the present. Another enduring aspect is the way humans respond to community structure. Even when groups were small, they developed roles, responsibilities, and systems of shared care. These structures changed over time, becoming more complex as populations grew, but the foundation remained. People organize themselves in ways that distribute tasks, maintain order, and support collective well-being. When disruptions appeared through migration, conflict, or environmental change, communities restructured themselves. This ability to reorganize, without losing a sense of togetherness, helped people survive conditions that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. We also see continuity in how humans approach uncertainty. Early societies developed strategies to handle unpredictable seasons or shifting landscapes. These strategies included storing food, creating diverse hunting or farming techniques, and building flexible social systems. Modern societies use different tools, but the underlying instinct is the same. People plan, prepare, and create safety nets to manage uncertainty. These responses show that even when the world changes dramatically, the way humans deal with uncertainty remains familiar. Another enduring quality is the inclination to teach. Every generation passes knowledge to the next. Sometimes the knowledge is practical, like how to build a shelter or how to identify edible plants. Sometimes it's cultural, like stories, rituals, or shared values. Even during periods when knowledge was lost, teaching continued. The content changed, but the instinct to share remained. This continuity ensured that even after major resets, people didn't start from zero. They always began with whatever their ancestors had passed down: skills, stories, tools, or frameworks for understanding the world. As we look at all these threads together, it becomes clear that what endures is not a single idea or invention. It is a collection of instincts and behaviors woven into human life over thousands of years. These qualities helped early humans survive through environmental challenges, near extinction events, and cycles of collapse and renewal. They shaped the way communities formed, how societies interacted, and how knowledge evolved. They continue to shape modern life in ways that reflect the deep history of adaptation. This continuity suggests that humanity's strength lies not in stability, but in the ability to respond to instability. Resets didn't weaken the species. They refined it. They clarified what mattered for survival and what could change. They encouraged flexibility while maintaining core patterns of cooperation, curiosity, and meaning-making. As a result, humanity carries forward a long history of resilience that appears even in everyday moments. How people solve problems, how they care for others, how they adjust routines, and how they interpret the world around them. All these patterns to the continuation of the story as another point in the ongoing movement of people adapting to the world and shaping it in return. Continuing the same rhythms that have carried humanity through every transformation before this one.